Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, I thought it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed and let's begin. Story 1, The Flicker. I had stayed late at the office that night, long after the echo of voices in the corridors had dissolved into silence. My desk, cluttered with stacks of documents and the pale glow of a solitary monitor, felt unusually cold, though the thermostat read a comfortable 22 degrees. The hum of the air conditioning was constant, almost soothing, yet beneath it I sensed an undercurrent of something off, something that I could not name. It started with the lift. I had taken it up to the 12th floor after a meeting in the lower floors and had been alone for some time, tapping at spreadsheets and emails, when I noticed a sound. A soft mechanical chime, distant but unmistakable, followed by the metallic sigh of the lift doors opening. I looked up from my screen. Empty. Not a single soul. Just the smooth, reflective interior of the lift, gleaming under the fluorescent lighting. I frowned and shook my head, telling myself that perhaps it had come down for the ground floor traffic, then returned without anyone on board. I continued typing, trying to convince myself of normalcy, but the chime returned after a few minutes, the doors sliding apart once again, revealing nothing. The emptiness of the shaft seemed deeper somehow, like the darkness inside the lift was sucking the light out of the floor. I told myself I was imagining it, that my mind was jumping at shadows. Still, the air on the 12th floor felt heavier, and I found myself holding my breath unconsciously whenever I heard that soft, metallic sigh. After a while, I leaned back in my chair and glanced at the clock. 10:30. My floor had been deserted for hours. I had checked the security log earlier that week, nothing unusual, but tonight the lift seemed to mock me, appearing and disappearing with no passengers, no sound beyond the mechanical sigh. I tried rational explanations. Perhaps someone was taking the stairs, or a maintenance team was doing late work, but that made no sense. The lift doors opened and closed in the same empty spot over and over, as though waiting. I decided to investigate. I stood, stretched my legs, and walked to the lift, a dull tension crawling across my spine. I pressed the button to call it down, and within moments, the familiar chime announced its arrival. The doors parted slowly, too slowly, and I stepped inside. The interior was spotless, the mirrors reflecting my anxious face back at me. I pressed the button for the ground floor, the familiar beep echoing in the enclosed space. The lift began to move. A soft vibration underfoot. And then, halfway down, I saw movement in the reflection of the mirror. A shadow, crouched low, moving across the empty space behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but the lift was empty. By the time I reached the ground floor, the doors slid open, revealing the deserted lobby. I stepped out cautiously, telling myself I was overreacting, imagining things in the mirrors. I walked past the security desk, expecting to see the night guard, but he was nowhere in sight. The corridor leading to the main exit stretched empty and silent, and yet I had the distinct impression that I was being watched. A flicker in the corner of my vision made me glance back. The lift doors were closing again. Nothing inside. I hurried toward the exit, my briefcase weighing heavily in my hand, and pushed through the double doors onto the street. The city at night seemed alive yet distant, a chorus of faint traffic and occasional sirens punctuating the darkness. I could feel the residual tension from the office pressing against my chest, like a hand tightening its grip. I had been alone for hours, yet the sensation of being followed had not faded. I hailed a cab, feeling the uncomfortable awareness of shadows clinging to the edges of the pavement. My thoughts cycled endlessly, overwork, exhaustion, imagination, rationality. I told myself that tomorrow I would check the CCTV. I would confirm that I had been alone. I reached my apartment after a brisk walk, the streets quieter than usual, the neon signs humming softly. I entered, locked the door, and poured myself a glass of water. My reflection in the kitchen window looked tired, strained. As I sipped, I realized that my mind could not shake the memory of the lift, the repeated opening, the shadow in the mirror. I told myself I was being foolish, that the mind sometimes amplifies the mundane into terror. Sleep would help. Perhaps tomorrow, I would laugh at the absurdity. Yet that night, as I lay in bed, I felt the pull of unease more acutely than I had in years. Every creak of the building, every distant footstep, made my chest tighten. The image of the empty lift, opening endlessly for no one, was lodged in my mind, repeating with obsessive insistence. I imagined it moving silently up and down the shaft, doors parting, doors closing, always empty, always waiting. And then, somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, I imagined the doors opening again, here in my apartment, in my own bedroom. I told myself it was impossible. A hallucination. My pulse eventually slowed, the darkness of the room pressing against my eyes until they closed. Yet the sense of something just beyond my awareness did not leave. It lingered like a whisper, like static at the edge of hearing, reminding me that being alone did not necessarily mean being safe. The following morning, I convinced myself that the previous night had been a combination of fatigue and overwork. Yet, as I walked to the office, the faint unease from the lift clung to me like a shadow. The city was bathed in an indifferent sunlight that did little to soothe the residue of anxiety. I tried to focus on mundane details, the angle of the light on glass facades, the smell of coffee drifting from a corner cafe, but my mind kept returning to the empty lift, its doors opening and closing as though mocking me. I shook my head, chalking it up to stress. I had deadlines, after all, and reality would not wait for superstition. The day passed with predictable monotony. Emails, reports, client calls. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that someone or something was moving in spaces just beyond my perception. The office had been quiet that morning, unusually so. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed sharper, more intrusive. During a coffee break, I noticed the lift again. On the monitor showing floor activity, the indicator flickered insistently. The lift was on the 12th floor. I glanced up from my mug. Empty lobby. Doors closed. The display reset. A rational mind would consider this normal. Sensors, glitches, timing. But I felt my pulse quicken. That night, I left the office earlier, hoping to reclaim some sense of normalcy. I walked home, head down, listening to the dull rhythm of my shoes on the pavement. Streetlights lined the path, familiar markers of safety. But one by one, they flickered as I passed, like the eye of some unseen entity, and then extinguished, plunging the street into incremental darkness. I glanced back. Nothing. Only the faint outline of the buildings against a bruised sky. My pace quickened. I told myself it was coincidence, electrical faults, but the darkness felt intentional, closing in. A low wind whispered through the alleys, carrying the scent of damp concrete and exhaust. The empty streets felt unnatural, each shadow a potential predator. My heart thumped loudly, a frantic drum, as the next streetlight died behind me. I tried to imagine the lights ahead, but the city seemed to stretch and warp. For a moment, I was convinced I had lost my bearings. The familiar route home twisted subtly in ways that made my stomach churn. And then I heard it, the scratch of a match striking behind me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The darkness behind me had a voice, not in words, but in sound. A single spark, a faint flare of light in the blackness. I could smell the sulfur before I saw the tiny glow, and the noise made my pulse spike. I told myself to run, but my legs refused to obey, rooted to the spot by a fear I could neither name nor rationalize. The light flared again, brief and tremulous, as though someone or something was testing me, marking me in the darkness. I bolted, My footsteps echoed in the empty street, hitting walls and abandoned cars, bouncing back at me in distorted rhythm. I did not dare look behind, even as the soft patter of something following or anticipating my movements accompanied me. The match flared once more, then vanished, and I felt an almost physical pressure pressing against my spine. I stumbled, colliding with a lamppost that still held its light. I scrambled upright, heart hammering, lungs burning. Ahead, the street lights were dying faster now, each one extinguished before I could reach it. The darkness was swallowing the path ahead as efficiently as it had devoured the path behind. Panic sharpened my senses. Every faint movement, every whisper of wind, sounded like footsteps. I remembered the lift. The emptiness of the office, the mirror reflection, the doors opening for no one. The parallels were undeniable. I was trapped in the same pattern, mirrored in the streets. Rational thought fled in waves, fear dominated. Yet part of me still sought reason, some explanation that would make sense of the escalating terror. There was none. I turned a corner onto a familiar street and the match struck again, almost in front of me this time. The flame illuminated nothing, no figure, no face, just an ephemeral flicker that left me drenched in dread. My instinct screamed to run blindly, yet I fought for some control, skirting buildings and alleyways, taking routes I knew by memory. My apartment was close, just a block away. I sprinted, lungs burning, fingers clawing at keys as I fumbled at the door. Inside, I slammed it shut, locking it with trembling hands. The darkness outside pressed against the glass, a living thing that seemed to pulse and breathe. I sank to the floor, heart racing, listening. Every sound, a distant car, a rat in the alley, my own ragged breathing felt amplified, threatening. I checked the locks again, the chains, the windows. Nothing could breach this space. Yet the sense of being hunted persisted. I could almost feel it, the presence just beyond the walls, invisible and patient. Hours passed. I stayed awake, moving from window to window, listening for the faintest cue, the slightest spark of the match. Dawn came slowly, painting the room in pale, hesitant light. The city outside returned to normalcy, the streetlights glowing steadily once more. I breathed a long sigh, convinced that exhaustion had magnified fear into something grotesque. Yet even as I slept, curled in the corner of my bed, I knew deep in my bones that whatever followed me through darkness had not left. And when night came again, I would face it once more. I did not sleep well that night, if sleep it could be called. Every noise in the apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, the distant rumble of traffic was magnified into a warning. My thoughts kept returning to the lift, to the darkness on the street, to the match that had flickered behind me with an almost deliberate cruelty. By morning, my hands trembled slightly as I prepared for work. I had tried to rationalize, tried to tell myself that logic would dissolve the residue of fear, yet the weight of the previous night clung like a stain I could not scrub away. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, the lobby bathed in the sterile fluorescence of morning light. The security guard, a man who always smiled at passing employees, glanced up from his desk and nodded. I forced a reply, my voice flat. The lift remained closed, doors shiny and silent, its usual chime absent. I stepped inside, pressing the button for the 12th floor, and felt the familiar tremor of anxiety ripple through me. I told myself it was ridiculous to fear a machine, yet the memory of the endless openings, the empty interior, haunted me. The doors parted smoothly on my floor. Empty. I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to focus on the workday ahead. I settled in my desk, but the sense of being watched refused to dissipate. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, shifting just beyond the edge of my vision. Occasionally, I thought I saw a figure flit past the mirrored walls of the conference rooms, or a shadow that didn't belong to any object in the room. I glanced at the lift. Its doors remained closed. For For hours I worked, the hours stretching into a rhythm of clicking keyboards, rustling papers, and the hum of fluorescent lights. Then it happened. The chime. Low, mechanical, and deliberate. I froze mid-typing, listening. The doors slid apart. Empty. I watched them, my pulse hammering, as they remained open for what felt like minutes, though the clock on the wall indicated only seconds had passed. The air around the lift seemed denser, almost viscous, pressing against my chest. I told myself to approach, to inspect, to prove it was nothing. My legs carried me forward, trembling, and I stepped inside. The mirrors reflected the office behind me, empty and fluorescent, but in the corner of my vision, movement again. A shadow, crouched and indistinct, moving across the mirrored wall. I spun. Nothing. I pressed the button for the ground floor, the familiar beep echoing hollowly. The lift moved, and with it, the shadow in the mirror receded, leaving only my anxious reflection. The descent felt interminable. The doors opened. Lobby empty. I stepped out, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the crouched shape following me silently. Nothing. Just the polished floors and the faint scent of cleaning chemicals. I fled the building, taking the stairs this time, my heart drumming erratically, lungs burning. Outside, the city had slipped into evening. Streetlights, those guardians of safety, began to flicker as I walked, one after another, until the pavement was swallowed in blackness. Panic clawed at me. I tried to rationalize faulty circuits, shadows of my own mind, but my senses screamed otherwise. The darkness felt alive, pressing in, shaping the streets around me. I heard it again, the faint strike of a match behind me. I dared not turn, muscles coiled in tension, adrenaline sharp in my veins. The footsteps that followed were soft but deliberate, matching my own in cadence, then diverging. I ducked into an alley, pressing my back against the cold brick. The shadows there seemed thicker, almost viscous, and the match flared briefly, illuminating nothing but darkness. My breath came in short, ragged bursts. Every instinct screamed to run, yet every instinct also warned that movement might draw it closer. I waited, heart hammering, listening. The light struck again, closer this time, and I could smell the sulfur unmistakably. Panic forced me from the alley, down winding streets, the darkness closing like a fist. As I neared my building, I realized with horror that the streetlights were no longer flickering, they were all extinguished, leaving the path before me a single unbroken void. The match flared behind me, and this time, I saw it, not the person, but the figure. A shadowed silhouette, featureless, crouched and small, moving with unnatural speed, striking the flame repeatedly. The flicker illuminated nothing of the figure but the air around it, thick and pulsing, as though it was bleeding the light from the world. I sprinted the final stretch, fumbling with my keys, fingers shaking violently. I slammed the door shut behind me, bolting every lock and chain. My apartment was small, cramped, but I felt the walls insufficient against what followed. Outside, the darkness pressed against the windows, and I could hear, faint but clear, the soft scratch of matches, the whisper of movement along the facade. My apartment felt like a thin shell, barely separating me from the predator stalking the city. Hours passed in tense silence. I dared not sleep. Every shadow on the walls became a potential threat, every flicker of light a signal of movement outside. When morning came, the streetlights flickered back to life. The city resumed its normal rhythm, oblivious to the events of the night. And yet, I knew without doubt that the figure had not left, merely retreated. Waiting. Patient. By evening, I understood something fundamental. It did not merely follow me. It fed on the absence of light, the tension of anticipation, the weakening of rational thought. The lift, the streets, the shadows, they were all conduits, pathways for it to reach me. and I could not avoid it forever. That night, I refused to leave my apartment. I barricaded the door with whatever I could find: chairs, a small bookshelf, even my briefcase. The darkness outside felt alive, shifting and waiting, as if aware of my attempts to seal myself in. I sat on the floor, knees drawn to my chest, staring at the faint glow of the streetlights beyond the window. For a few hours, I allowed myself to breathe, convincing myself that the figure was restrained by the city's illumination, bound to the night. But as darkness deepened, the lights flickered again. One by one, they died. And then I heard it, the soft, deliberate strike of a match. It came from the street below, a spark in the blackness, and then another, and another. The flame illuminated nothing but fleeting shadows, the same crouched, featureless silhouette from the night before. It moved with deliberate patience, stalking along the empty streets, striking the match at intervals. The sulphurous smell drifted faintly upward, carried by a chill wind that slithered through the cracked window frame. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to flee, but the front door, my only escape, was blocked by the black void outside, stretching endlessly, punctuated by the flickering light of the matches. I considered the office, the lift. The memory of its doors opening and closing endlessly, revealing nothing but shadows, became a horrifying mirror of what I saw now. The entity was no longer confined to metal and concrete. It had learned, adapted, found me. I felt the city itself bend toward it, the streets warping under the weight of the darkness. Each light that died was a heartbeat stolen from the world, and with each strike of the match, it came closer. I backed away from the window, the apartment shrinking around me. Furniture that had been familiar now seemed oppressive, corners stretching into darkness, walls leaning inward as if to contain me. The shadow flitted across the street again, just beyond the faint glow of the apartment's interior lights. I could almost make out a shape, small, crouched, but always featureless, a void with limbs, moving with impossible silence. I could hear nothing else, not a footstep on the pavement, not a car in the distance. Just the low hiss of the wind and the faint strikes of fire against phosphorus and air. I needed a plan, any plan. I rummaged through drawers, finding a flashlight, matches, candles. Anything to assert some control. The flashlight was weak, a pitiful circle of light in the growing void outside. I turned it toward the street. The figure recoiled, or so it seemed, though it made no sound. It was as though it existed only in the absence of illumination, a predator bound to shadows, a reflection of fear itself. I tried to reach the front door, to escape into the night, but every movement brought the match closer, and with each strike, the darkened street advanced, a tide of black swallowing the familiar city around me. Time fractured. Seconds stretched into eternity. I moved between rooms, lighting candles in every corner, holding the flashlight steady, but the darkness crept, curling into corners, sliding beneath doors. I realized, with a cold certainty, that it did not merely follow me, it inhabited the spaces between light, the spaces where rationality failed, where fear was absolute. My apartment was no longer a refuge, it was a cage, and I was the prey. The match struck again, this time at my window. I swung the flashlight in its direction. For a brief instant, the figure appeared, more defined than ever, limbs elongated, crouched, stretching impossibly as if the shadows themselves had taken form. Its face remained featureless, but I felt it staring at me, understanding me, knowing every thought, every fear, every instinct I possessed. A primal scream clawed up my throat, but I stifled it. Sound would betray me. Movement would betray me. I realized that no rational explanation could save me now. I remembered the lift, the endless openings, the empty reflections. This was the same thing, magnified. It had grown patient over the weeks, waiting for me to lapse, to invite it with exhaustion, fear, the belief that I was safe. And now it had me, surrounded on all sides by shadows and silence. The match struck again, closer, almost against the glass. I could smell the sulfur sharply now, thick in my lungs, filling the room with a choking tension. I backed into the farthest corner, the flashlight in front of me like a talisman. And then I understood. It fed on my fear, thrived on hesitation, grew stronger when I doubted, when I rationalized. Panic was the conduit. I forced myself to stop moving, to control my breath, to focus my mind on one thing: survival. The match flared again. The figure surged toward it. I held my gaze steady, refused to look away. And then, the impossible happened. It recoiled, a distortion of shadow and movement, and vanished. The match sputtered, fell to the pavement, and went out. Silence returned. My apartment was intact, the streetlights flickering back to life, the city resuming its indifferent rhythm. I sank to the floor, shaking, tears running down my face. I had survived. Whatever it was, it had been repelled, if only temporarily. The lesson was clear. It was patient, adaptive, but not invincible. And most importantly, I had learned its weakness. I could not give it fear. The next day, I approached the office with a cautious wariness that I had never known before. The lift remained closed, silent, its polished doors reflecting the morning sun. I had slept little, drinking coffee in tiny sips, my mind rehearsing strategies, possibilities, and worst-case scenarios. I told myself that whatever had stalked me last night could not cross the threshold of reason, that sunlight and human activity were barriers it could not breach. But deep down, I knew better. The nights had proven it patient, adaptive, and unrelenting. Inside, the office was quiet, almost unnaturally so. My colleagues moved in slow, deliberate motions, oblivious to the tension clinging to the walls. I focused on routine tasks, deliberately occupying my mind, counting spreadsheets, calibrating data, doing anything to suppress the memory of the match, the darkness, the crouched figure. Yet I could feel the pull of the lift in the corner of the floor, a silent heartbeat that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my own. I avoided it, keeping my distance, reminding myself the lift was metal and mirrors, nothing more. Rationality, I repeated. Rationality. Hours passed. The office lights flickered faintly at one point, a minor electrical fault, or so I told myself. And then I heard it, the chime. Low, mechanical, deliberate. My stomach dropped. I froze mid-typing, chest tightening as the doors parted. Empty. I forced myself forward, each step deliberate, measured, maintaining control over the rising panic. The lift doors closed slowly, the mechanical sigh echoing in the empty corridor. I told myself to ignore it, to carry on. But the memory of last night's darkness was insistent, and I could feel my pulse accelerating. That evening, I left the office for home with extreme caution. The city felt ordinary, benign even, under the warm glow of streetlights. I focused on light, consciously stepping only under illuminated areas, calculating every movement. Yet, as I walked, I felt the same pressure, the same weight of being observed. A streetlight flickered briefly behind me, and my pulse spiked. I refused to look. I refused to let fear dictate my reactions. Steps quickened, breathing even. Control, I reminded myself, was my weapon. Fear would give it dominion. And then I saw it, not fully, but enough. A shadow flitted along the far side of the street, crouched, indistinct, moving in unnatural ways. The match struck briefly, a tiny flare against the blackness, illuminating its featureless form. I forced myself to stand tall, to move deliberately in the opposite direction. I noticed something critical. Every time I confronted it without hesitation, without panic, the shadow seemed to hesitate, recoiling slightly, unsure. My mind raced. Rational thought had been my ally all along. The moment I let instinct, fear, or imagination dominate, it gained strength. I ran only when I reached the long straight street leading to my apartment, never turning, keeping my steps measured, focusing on the path, the light, and my breath. The shadow followed but hesitated at every light, every corner illuminated, unable to cross the boundary of deliberate, controlled presence. I understood finally. It could manipulate darkness, but it could not endure deliberate observation. Its hunger was fear itself, amplified by hesitation, doubt, and panic. Inside my apartment, I reinforced the door again, this time methodically, deliberately, without trembling. Candles and a flashlight were placed in every corner. I sat down, controlling every aspect of my environment, maintaining absolute composure. I focused on my breathing, my heartbeat, every sense directed outward, assessing, monitoring, never yielding to terror. Hours passed. The night came and went. No match strikes, no whispers, no shadows moved against the walls. The darkness outside was just that, darkness. No predator, no creeping void. Morning arrived. Sunlight spilled across the floor, warm and constant. Streetlights were solid, electric, and unwavering. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to believe I had survived, that my understanding had given me mastery over the terror that had pursued me. I left my apartment deliberately, calmly, always under light, never yielding to instinctual fear. Every step reinforced my control. I walked the streets, observing, noting, never reacting to shadows. The city was alive with ordinary movement. Weeks passed. I returned to the office, cautiously but steadily, ignoring the lift unless necessary. And each time, I walked deliberately, keeping my gaze focused, my mind sharp, aware. The lift never opened for no one again. Streetlights remained constant. The figure never appeared. It had tested me, fed on my fear, and found me capable of discipline, of reason, of refusal to surrender to panic. I understood then the final lesson. It was not an external force entirely. It existed wherever fear reigned, in the shadows of hesitation and the silence of panic. I survived. Not by fleeing, not by hiding, but by mastering the darkness within myself. The city was indifferent, the office ordinary, and the nights, once lethal, were now mine to inhabit without dread. The lift remained a machine, streetlights remained steadfast, and the crouched, featureless shadow was gone, banished by the clarity and control I had claimed. I had walked through fear, unbroken, and emerged into light. Story 2, The Watching Figure. I had always liked the quiet of the shop after hours. There was a strange calm in the fluorescent hum, the soft tick of the clocks, the faint smell of polished wood and cleaning products. The city outside fell into muffled obscurity at night, and I liked to think of myself as the last line between order and chaos, the person responsible for locking it all away until morning. On that Wednesday, I lingered a little longer than usual, straightening shelves and arranging display units, trying to ignore the creeping fatigue that settled in my shoulders. I had just finished dusting the new display of electronics near the front window when I decided to take a quick glance at the CCTV monitors. A habit, really one I did unconsciously every night. The screen showed the usual, empty aisles and the deserted street outside, streetlights casting faint halos on the wet pavement. I rotated through the cameras slowly, checking the entrance, the back door, the side alley, everything as I had done countless times before. That was when I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the glass doors, faint in the monochrome glow of the night camera. At first, I thought it was a reflection, a trick of the light. But as I adjusted the angle of the camera, the figure remained there, perfectly still. My pulse quickened. I peered closer, squinting at the grainy image. It was tall, slender, draped in dark clothing that blended almost seamlessly into the street. I couldn't make out a face. The person, or whatever it was standing a few feet back from the glass, just out of reach, watching. I told myself it had to be someone outside, loitering, perhaps waiting for a friend, or just passing by. Rational explanations flooded my mind: street cleaning, a jogger, someone lost. But as I watched, a sense of unease began to coil in my stomach. I checked the street outside the window. Empty. Not a soul in sight. No headlights, no passing pedestrians, not even a stray cat. The air on the monitors was still, oppressive in its emptiness. The figure, however, had not moved. It remained there, motionless, as if it was waiting for something. I leaned back from the monitor, rubbing my eyes. I could feel the exhaustion tugging at the edges of my focus. Perhaps I was imagining things, tired eyes playing tricks on me. I shook my head, telling myself to calm down. The doors were locked. I had just double-checked the front lock. Whoever it was couldn't get in. My heartbeat began to slow, and I returned to my cleaning, forcing the incident from my mind. 10 minutes later, I glanced at the monitors again. The figure was closer. I froze mid-motion, holding the rag in my hand, watching in disbelief. It had not moved in any normal sense. I had not seen footsteps or the sway of clothing in the breeze, but somehow it was nearer, positioned directly in front of the glass. The street behind it remained empty, no shadows to explain its appearance. My breath caught, and I felt the first prickling of real fear. I pressed the zoom function on the camera, scanning the figure for any features, any clue of identity. Nothing. Its head was bowed slightly, obscured by what looked like a hood, but the sense of awareness, the feeling that it was staring at me, was overwhelming. Rational thoughts clashed with instinct. If it were a person, why had it not moved for 10 minutes? Why had no sound reached me, no footsteps, no wind rustling the empty street? I felt exposed, a voyeur in my own shop, monitored by something that should not exist in a place this mundane. Shaking, I stood and edged toward the front door, pressing my ear against the glass, listening for movement outside. The street remained silent. The figure had not flinched, not budged an inch. My skin crawled. My instinct screamed at me to retreat, to run, yet curiosity, irrational, foolish curiosity, kept my eyes locked on the monitor. I fetched my phone, planning to call the security company or even the police, and when I glanced back, my heart nearly stopped. The figure was gone from the camera feed. I sprinted to the front window, pressing my forehead against the cold glass. Empty. The streetlights flickered in their usual rhythm. No sound. No movement. I scoured the alleyways visible from my vantage point. Nothing. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it entirely, that fatigue and too many lonely nights had played tricks on me. The rational mind offered relief. Exhaustion, grainy footage, optical illusion. It had to be nothing. I turned back to the monitors, but the unease refused to fade. There was a lingering anomaly on the screen, a subtle distortion, a brief flicker near the entrance camera, like a shadow that didn't belong. I leaned closer, feeling my pulse hammering in my ears. Then I noticed it. The timestamp on the camera had skipped forward by several seconds. I hadn't pressed any buttons, and yet the feed had jumped, and in that jump, the figure had vanished entirely. The store felt suddenly colder. I wrapped my arms around myself, telling myself it was just a draft, just nerves, just the mind overreacting. I started the nightly routine with trembling hands, checking doors, locking windows, flicking switches, all the while glancing nervously at the monitor. Minutes passed without incident. I told myself I would leave quickly, and as soon as the doors were locked behind me, I would be safe. But the lingering sense of being watched remained, a weight pressing at the base of my skull. I exited into the night, keys jingling in my hand, and as I walked down the street, the familiar city lights offered little comfort. Somewhere behind me, faint, almost imperceptible, there was movement, a soft step, then silence. I glanced over my shoulder. Empty street. The sense of being followed clung to me like a second skin. That night, for the first time, I understood a truth I could not shake. Sometimes, the ordinary world hides eyes that watch, and sometimes, those eyes choose to linger, unobserved yet utterly present. I couldn't sleep that night. The ordinary hum of my apartment, the faint buzz of the refrigerator, the soft tap of water dripping somewhere felt amplified, oppressive in its familiarity. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, linger closer, as if testing the limits of my perception. I kept turning over the events of the shop in my mind. The figure had been real, or at least, my senses had insisted it was. My rational mind offered a dozen mundane explanations, a reflection, a passerby obscured by darkness, a glitch in the CCTV feed. But every attempt at reason only sharpened the sense of wrongness, the gnawing awareness that I had been observed in a place I thought was secure. The following evening, I returned to the shop with deliberate caution. I locked the doors behind me, checked every window, every latch. The familiar fluorescent hum greeted me, but this time it was brittle, hollow. I tried to focus on my cleaning tasks, methodically arranging merchandise, wiping counters, straightening labels. The night felt heavier, more crowded, though I was alone. I kept my eyes on the monitors, cycling through the cameras, half expecting, half dreading the reappearance of the figure. Minutes stretched. Nothing happened. Rationality seemed vindicated, yet a tension in my shoulders refused to loosen. I busied myself with inventory sheets, ticking boxes, writing numbers, forcing my mind into rote repetition. That's when I noticed a small detail on one of the monitors, the reflection of my own movement in the glass doors. Only, it wasn't quite mine. The posture was slightly wrong, the angle of the head too sharp, too deliberate. I leaned closer. My pulse hitched. The shadow lingered behind the doorframe, crouched, just beyond the edge of the camera's light. I told myself it was a trick of the grainy feed, fatigue exaggerating a simple reflection. But the more I looked, the less plausible that seemed. The shadow shifted slightly, perfectly timed with my own movements, as if it were mimicking me or waiting for me to act. The hairs on the back of my neck stood rigid. My breath came shallow, uneven. I moved toward the door, but my legs felt heavy, reluctant. A rational mind would have stepped back, called the police, or left immediately. Mine argued with itself, torn between disbelief and a creeping terror that refused to be rationalized. I tried to distract myself, pretending to focus on the monitors, scanning for ordinary threats. But the figure did not retreat. It remained, crouched in stillness, on the edge of perception. I adjusted the camera angle, hoping the shift would make it vanish. It didn't. It was always just there, just beyond clarity, like a stain of darkness on the world. I could feel the intensity of its observation pressing against me, a weight that seemed to echo inside my skull. I picked up my phone, considering calling the police, but hesitated. What could I say? Someone loitering? A shadow? By the time I had formed the words in my head, the figure vanished. No motion, no hint of retreat, simply gone. My pulse slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. I laughed softly, nervously, shaking my head. Surely I was imagining it. Surely. I continued my duties, attempting to ignore the monitors. My eyes drifted inevitably back. The figure had returned, now positioned in front of the side window, staring outward, or was it inward? Its hooded head was bowed slightly, featureless in the poor resolution, yet I could feel its awareness like a hand on my shoulder. I forced myself to look away, but the sense of being watched lingered, thick and suffocating. I couldn't focus on inventory, couldn't complete any task. I was trapped in a loop of observation and dread. Hours passed. The shop's fluorescent lights hummed insistently. Outside, the streets were empty, lifeless. The figure appeared and disappeared with no rhyme or reason, each reappearance sharper, more insistent. My rational explanations crumbled. The figure didn't belong to this world of glass, cement, and light. It existed in the spaces between observation and ignorance, thriving on the vulnerability of an unseen gaze. When it finally vanished for the night, I felt relief, but it was thin, fragile. I locked the doors and left, walking home under the streetlights that now seemed weak and insufficient. I kept my eyes on every reflection in the shop windows as I passed, every shadow beneath street lamps, every flicker of movement that might be nothing or everything. My apartment offered no real solace. Every window felt like a potential vantage point, every shadow a stalking shape. Sleep arrived fitfully, fragmented by dreams of hooded shapes and mirrors, crouched figures at windows, and the endless, silent surveillance of something that should not exist. By the time morning came, I understood that rational explanations would not protect me. The figure was patient. It was persistent. And it had chosen me. That evening, I returned to the shop with a mix of resolve and dread. I told myself I had to confront it, to reclaim some sense of control over the space that had been rendered uncanny by its presence. The streets were quiet, ordinary, yet I felt a creeping unease that no rational thought could dispel. My hands trembled slightly as I inserted the key into the lock and pushed the door open. The familiar smell of polish and cardboard greeted me, but tonight it felt different, somehow heavy, as if the air itself had been thickened by anticipation. I began my closing routine, meticulously checking shelves and straightening displays, all the while keeping my eyes on the CCTV monitors. Each camera showed the usual empty aisles and the deserted street outside. But then I noticed a subtle anomaly, the reflection in the glass of the entrance, a faint blur that didn't match any movement I had made. I leaned closer, adjusting the zoom on the monitor. The figure crouched just beyond the glass, stationary, yet impossible to ignore. It didn't move toward me, it didn't need to. Its presence alone was oppressive, a weight pressing into my chest, making breathing shallow and difficult. I tried to rationalize, whispering to myself that it was a trick of the monitor, a delayed feed, some mundane reflection from a passing car or the flicker of a streetlight. But the more I tried to reason, the more my senses insisted otherwise. The figure was deliberate. It was aware. It had waited through every hour of my labor, through every quiet, empty stretch of street. My rational mind began to fracture under the pressure, replaced by a creeping, insistent fear that seemed to pulse with the fluorescent lights above me. Minutes stretched into a long, stifling hour. Every time I looked at the monitor, it remained. Sometimes closer to the entrance, sometimes at the side window, yet always crouched, always featureless, always watching. I forced myself to move around the shop, checking every door and window, counting steps and breaths, trying to establish control over the environment. But no matter where I went, the figure appeared in my periphery, in reflections, in shadows that shouldn't exist. My pulse raced, my chest ached, and a tight knot of dread twisted my stomach. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? A shadow? A ghostly watcher? The words felt ridiculous, inadequate. Even if they came, would they see what I saw? Would they feel the suffocating presence that refused to be rationalized, the silent gaze that seemed to measure my very thoughts? My hand shook as I pressed my phone against my ear, thumb hovering over the call button, but fear rooted me in place. The figure did not move, yet I felt its attention like a physical force, tugging at the edges of my mind. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The entire shop shivered in fluorescent pulses. My breath caught. When the light steadied, the figure was no longer visible through the monitor. I thought relief would wash over me, but it didn't. Instead, the space itself seemed wrong, as if it had been bent and reshaped while I wasn't looking. Shadows pulled in corners that should have been illuminated. Every reflection in the glass seemed to twitch, distorting momentarily before returning to normal. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and entirely alone. I took a tentative step toward the entrance, heart hammering, intending to check the door once more. The moment I neared it, a faint scratching sound echoed from outside, light, deliberate, as if fingernails traced the pavement. I froze, hand on the doorknob. The sound repeated, closer, and a sense of awareness, of intelligence behind the motion, wrapped around me like a noose. I pressed my forehead against the glass and peered outside. Empty street. No figure, no shadow, nothing visible. Yet the scratching persisted, subtle, measured, impossible to ignore. Panic rose in me, but I forced it down, breath by measured breath. I had to remain calm. I had to maintain control. Otherwise, I would lose myself entirely. I edged around the shop, retracing my steps, checking every window, every corner. The scratching followed, now faint, almost teasing, yet undeniably present. My phone slipped from my hand onto the floor. I stooped to retrieve it and froze. In the reflection of the monitor, crouched just beyond the glass, the figure had returned. Closer than before. I backed away, heart hammering, and collided with a display rack. The crash made a hollow clang through the empty shop. The figure remained, still, patient, crouched, featureless. And then, without warning, it vanished again, leaving only the faintest shimmer in the glass, a distortion in the reflected light. I realized, with a cold certainty, that it didn't need to enter the shop. It didn't need to make itself tangible. Its presence alone was enough to bend perception, to gnaw at the edges of sanity, to make me question what was real. I left that night trembling, closing the shop faster than ever. As I walked home under the ordinary streetlights, I felt the faint, unyielding weight of its gaze. I knew it had followed me, invisible yet aware. Rationality could not protect me. Sleep, distance, reason, none of these were shields. The Watcher was patient. It was relentless. And it had chosen me. That night, I didn't wait for the shop to close. I arrived hours early, intent on confronting the growing unease, on observing the space I had long thought safe. The streets outside were quiet, but I felt the familiar pull of dread as I stepped inside. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, too bright, too still, bathing every corner in sterile clarity. I moved methodically, checking the doors and windows, ensuring nothing was left unsecured. Yet even in the familiarity, I felt a subtle wrongness, shadows pooling where they should not, reflections in the glass that did not align with my own movements. I turned on the CCTV monitors. The aisles were empty, the street beyond deserted. I exhaled slowly, attempting to steady my nerves. But then I saw it, the figure crouched just beyond the entrance, featureless, dark against the dim glow of the street. It had returned while I was elsewhere, as if the shop itself had carried it there, unseen, until I looked. A chill crept up my spine. My rational mind scrambled for explanations, but the stillness, the impossibility of its presence, overwhelmed reason. It was waiting, patient, and utterly aware. I approached the entrance cautiously, every step deliberate, each movement measured to avoid provoking panic. The moment I drew near, the figure shifted, just slightly, and I felt a wave of awareness brush against my mind. It wasn't just observing, it was studying, calculating, anticipating. I recoiled instinctively, heart hammering, and the lights flickered once, briefly dimming. The shadow recoiled, almost imperceptibly, before settling again, crouched and immobile, a stillness that demanded acknowledgement. I tried to leave. My hands fumbled with the lock, keys slipping from clammy fingers. But as I turned back, the monitor showed it had moved to the side window, closer than ever. Its head tilted slightly, the suggestion of a gaze following me, although there were no discernible eyes. The weight of its attention pressed against my chest, compressing the air, making it hard to breathe. I realized, with a sickening certainty, that it was no longer bound by the exterior. It existed in the threshold of perception itself, capable of shaping reality through its awareness. I retreated to the center of the shop, circling cautiously, trying to maintain the illusion of control. The figure mirrored me in the reflections of the glass doors, crouched and patient. Every mirror, every polished surface became a potential gateway. The lights flickered again, the fluorescent hum intensifying, and for a moment I swore the air itself vibrated with anticipation. I had reached a limit where rational thought could no longer offer solace. It was a predator that thrived on fear, on hesitation, on the awareness of being observed. My phone vibrated on the counter, a message from my landlord, innocuous and mundane. But in that instant, the figure shifted abruptly, closer, crouched outside the monitor's frame. I lunged, grabbing a flashlight and shining it toward the street. The beam cut through the darkness, and for a moment, I saw it, not fully, but enough to sense the elongated, inhuman limbs, the crouched posture, the unnatural stillness. And then it vanished again, melting into the blackness like ink in water. Panic surged. I bolted for the doors, fumbling with keys, hands slick with sweat. The lock turned slowly, deliberately, as if resisting. Outside, the streetlights flickered and dimmed, shadows creeping along the pavements, twisting and writhing. I sprinted into the street, my footsteps echoing unnaturally, each one answering to a silence too complete to be ordinary. Behind me, the faint rustle of movement followed, deliberate, almost teasing. My lungs burned, but I refused to look back. I realized then that escape was no longer about doors or locks, it was about perception. The watcher thrived where fear ruled, where hesitation reigned. Every glance over the shoulder, every pulse of panic, fed it, gave it substance, allowed it to occupy the spaces of the world. My only chance was clarity, control, and a refusal to grant it dominion over my mind. I slowed, focused on measured breaths, counted steps, and refused to imagine what might be behind me. The scratching sounds continued at a distance, now punctuated by the subtle snap of movement on the pavement. I forced my gaze straight ahead, ignoring reflections, ignoring shadows. And then, impossibly, the oppressive weight lifted slightly. The streetlights steadied. The darkness outside became ordinary, inert. I reached my apartment and slammed the door behind me, bolting it with methodical care. The night seemed still, neutral once more. For the first time, I understood the true nature of the horror. It was patient. It was adaptive. But it required fear, hesitation, and doubt to exist in any meaningful sense. Control of self, of mind, was the only defense. And though I survived that night, I knew that vigilance would have to be constant. The watcher had not gone. It was simply patient, waiting for the moment I might falter. The following week, I approached the shop with an uneasy determination. Each step toward the familiar glass doors felt heavier than the last, the fluorescent hum above seeming sharper, more insistent. I had spent nights rehearsing strategies, visualizing every action, every contingency. The watcher had not returned since my last encounter, but the memory of its crouched, featureless presence lingered like a stain on my mind. I knew it had not left. It never truly left. Patience was its ally. Observation, its power. And now, I had to reclaim my own space, or risk being undone entirely. I unlocked the doors and stepped inside. The shop was silent, empty in the ordinary way it should be, yet every reflection, every mirrored surface felt charged with potential threat. I moved methodically, as if performing a ritual, checking shelves, straightening displays, sweeping the floor. My eyes continually flicked to the monitors. The empty aisle stared back, ordinary and still. I forced myself to focus, counting breaths, controlling each motion. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, just a pulse, but I forced myself not to react. Fear was the conduit, control was the shield. Hours passed. The city outside darkened, ordinary streetlights casting halos of safety over wet pavement. I moved through my closing routine with deliberate precision, every step measured, every action rehearsed. Yet, in the corner of the entrance monitor, I felt a pulse, a weight pressing against perception itself. The figure returned. It crouched beyond the glass, featureless, yet unmistakable. My pulse surged, but I forced myself to meet it, to acknowledge its presence without hesitation, without panic. The sensation was like pressing against water, a resistance that rippled through the shop, yet I remained steady. I realized then that the Watcher's power was not physical but psychological. It existed in the cracks of fear, the spaces where doubt and hesitation held sway. And if I refused those cracks, refused to yield to instinctive terror, it could not manifest. Slowly, deliberately, I stepped toward the entrance, flashlight in hand, illuminating the narrow strip of pavement outside. The figure flinched, recoiled slightly, though it did not move away entirely. I held my gaze, unwavering, and the oppressive weight began to ebb, like water draining from a vessel. The minutes stretched into a tense hour. I remained steady, refusing to look away, refusing to imagine it beyond the visible, refusing to acknowledge anything but what my senses directly perceived. The shop became a chamber of light and reflection, every corner observed, every mirror accounted for. Gradually, the figure's presence diminished. It crouched less rigidly, less defined, until the distorted reflection in the glass no longer pulsed with anticipation. The shadow thinned, becoming insubstantial, until finally, it vanished entirely. I breathed deeply, allowing myself to feel the first real sense of relief in weeks. The shop returned to normal. The aisles were empty. The street outside was ordinary. No crouched figure, no soft scratching, no distorted reflections. I had survived not by fleeing, not by barricading myself in, but by mastering the one thing the Watcher thrived upon, fear. Its power had been nothing but the gaps in my courage, the hesitation that I allowed to fester. By refusing to yield, I had expelled it from my world. The nights that followed were quiet. I closed the shop as usual, under ordinary streetlights that never flickered, along streets that were ordinary and empty. Shadows behaved themselves. Reflections aligned. Mirrors and glass became ordinary again. I walked through the aisles with deliberate calm, counting steps, rehearsing the rituals I had developed. Each night reinforced the lesson: the Watcher existed only where I permitted it. Its hunger was psychological, its dominion ephemeral. Control, clarity, and the refusal to panic were my shields. Weeks later, I could almost forget it, but I remained vigilant. Every shadow, every reflection, every twitch in the corner of my eye reminded me that it could return if I faltered. I understood, finally, that the ordinary world contained lurking presences, waiting patiently, feeding on fear. And I had been chosen, tested, observed. But I had endured. I had survived. The shop was mine again. I was not haunted because the figure had left. I was unhaunted because I refused to grant it a foothold in my perception. I locked up that night with deliberate care, walked home in measured steps under ordinary streetlights, and slept without terror for the first time in weeks. The Watcher, patient and silent, had found no opening. And I, vigilant and resolute, had reclaimed my world. Fear had been the true predator. I had conquered it. Story 3: The Circle. We had driven for hours, winding along empty country roads that seemed to stretch endlessly under the dull gray of a late autumn sky. I loved this, the sense of distance from everything familiar, the release from the constant hum of phones, traffic, and the invisible pressure of other people's expectations. Amy drove, her hands firm on the wheel, eyes alert, yet relaxed in that way that made me feel secure. I watched the countryside slip past the windows, dense woods and open fields, the occasional river reflecting the faint light that filtered through the clouds. We stopped at a small clearing that appeared after a bend in the road. The forest opened just enough to accommodate the car, a flat stretch of earth framed by tall pines and low-lying bracken. It seemed perfect for a wild camp, private and quiet. We carried the bags down a slight slope, breath visible in the cold air, and I could feel the tension of the drive dissipate with each step into the forest. The smell of damp earth, moss, and fallen leaves was strong, grounding, almost comforting. We set up the tent together, working efficiently, joking occasionally about our lack of experience in backwoods camping. By the time we finished, the sun was low, casting long shadows that danced through the trees with every gust of wind. Amy started a small fire in a shallow pit we dug together, and I gathered twigs and kindling, noting how quickly darkness approached. We ate a simple dinner of sandwiches and boiled water for coffee, the ritual of it normalizing the isolation. I remember thinking it was strange how quiet it was, how every sound seemed amplified, the rustle of leaves, the crackle of the fire, the distant call of a bird. It was so still it felt almost suspended in time. As night fell fully, the forest became a different place entirely. Shapes blended into shadows, trees swayed with subtle menace, and the wind carried unfamiliar noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, small animals moving unseen. Amy and I laughed nervously, attributing every sound to forest creatures or the wind. Rational explanations, I reminded myself. The night was alive, yes, but not dangerous. We lay in the tent eventually, sleeping bags zipped up, bodies close for warmth. Outside, the fire had died down to embers, faint orange flickers disappearing in the darkness. Sleep came slowly. I remember waking briefly to a gust of wind that shifted the tent walls and made them flap against the stakes. I could hear Amy breathing softly beside me, a comforting sound. I drifted again, only to wake later with the strange sense that we weren't entirely alone. At first, I chalked it up to dream remnants, half-formed anxieties mingling with the isolation of the forest. But the feeling persisted, a subtle pressure, a tingle along the base of my skull, like the weight of eyes just beyond vision. Morning arrived not with clarity but with a faint, unsettling stillness. The wind had dropped, the forest silent, eerily so. I stretched and crawled out of the tent first, the cold ground damp against my palms. Amy followed, rubbing her eyes, still half asleep. That's when I noticed it, footprints. At first, I thought they were ours, misplaced from our camp chores. But they weren't. They formed a circle around the tent, encircling us perfectly, as if someone had walked deliberately, measured steps. I stepped closer, inspecting the prints. They were too uniform to be random, too neat to belong to deer or foxes. Some of them were larger than our feet, elongated slightly, yet humanoid. My stomach dropped. I called Amy over, trying to sound casual, joking about it being pranksters. But even as I spoke, my voice faltered. Amy frowned, crouching to examine the prints. "That's not ours," she said quietly. The circle was precise, complete. Every angle, every gap, aligned perfectly around the tent. Could it be animals? I suggested, though I felt ridiculous. The prints were too deliberate, too contained, too human in rhythm to belong to any wildlife I knew. Her eyes met mine, wide with unease. I tried to rationalize. Maybe someone had walked here during the night, perhaps campers who had left before sunrise. But then, Why leave a perfect circle around our tent? And we were far from any path, any road. Our car was the only vehicle visible from the clearing. A creeping anxiety settled in, and I realized that we hadn't heard anyone at all. No footsteps, no whispers, no rustling that suggested human presence. Nothing. Yet these prints were here, undeniably, impossibly. I felt my pulse quicken. Rational thought struggled to override the creeping dread. Something had been here. Someone or something had moved around our sleeping forms in the dark, carefully, deliberately. I glanced around the clearing, seeing nothing but trees and morning mist. The forest seemed to have grown denser overnight, shadows thickening along the edges, bending the familiar shapes into unfamiliar forms. Amy's hand found mine. We both shivered, the silence around us suddenly loud, oppressive. We packed quickly, gathering our belongings with an urgency born of unease. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling the weight of invisible eyes on our backs, the forest suddenly unfamiliar, threatening. The prints followed us in my mind, circling the tent, circling us, lingering. I resolved then to leave as quickly as possible, ignoring the normal morning beauty of the forest, ignoring the cold, damp air, ignoring anything that might distract from escape. Even as we carried our gear to the car, I couldn't shake the thought, the circle had appeared during the night. No one had approached the tent, yet it had been drawn around us with meticulous care. The rational explanations faltered, leaving only a gnawing certainty that we had been observed while we slept, that something had walked around us when we were most vulnerable. And I knew, deep in my chest, that the forest had watched, and it had left a message that we did not yet understand. We tried to convince ourselves it had been a prank. A passing hiker, maybe, someone curious, someone foolish enough to circle a tent in the night. But the more we examined the clearing in the daylight, the less plausible that seemed. There were no footprints leading to the circle, no signs of a trail, no evidence anyone had come near. The forest itself seemed to swallow space, to erase paths behind us. Every rational explanation eroded like sand underwater. We could only stare at the empty clearing, the perfect circle around our tent, and feel a creeping, inexplicable dread. After a hasty breakfast of cold coffee and granola, we decided to explore the forest, hoping distance might restore some sense of normalcy. The mist clung to the ground, curling around roots and fallen leaves, making every step squelch softly in the wet earth. The trees towered above us, skeletal against the pale morning light, their branches forming dark arcs that bent overhead, casting twisted shadows on the forest floor. I noticed that with every step we took, the quiet became more profound, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Birds avoided us. No squirrels scurried. Even the wind, which should have whispered through the pines, was barely perceptible. Amy walked ahead, occasionally turning to look at me, her expression a mixture of unease and forced cheer. "It's just a forest," she said, her voice tight. "Maybe someone really did prank us. Maybe it's nothing." I nodded, but I didn't believe her. Rational explanations seemed useless here. The circle had violated a space that should have been safe, and the forest now felt alive, as though it had noticed our intrusion, as though it had decided we weren't welcome. We wandered down a faint deer trail, careful not to stray too far. The undergrowth pressed in from the sides, damp moss brushing against our legs. Every step seemed to echo unnaturally, though I could hear nothing behind us. Occasionally, I thought I glimpsed shapes among the trees, shadows that shifted just at the corner of my vision. When I turned to look, nothing was there. I told myself it was exhaustion, anxiety, and the subtle trick of light through mist. Still, I felt watched, a persistent pressure that made my skin crawl. By mid-morning, the forest opened into a shallow valley. A thin stream trickled through it, and we paused to drink and rest. Amy's hand trembled slightly as she held her cup of water. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, eyes scanning the misted tree line. I listened. Nothing but the soft murmur of water and the faint rustle of leaves far above. Yet something had brushed against my peripheral vision, a subtle shift, movement that belonged to no animal I knew. I laughed nervously, but my throat was dry, my pulse racing. We pressed on, hoping to reach higher ground, thinking that elevation might give us some perspective, some rational reassurance. But the forest seemed to resist. Every path we tried narrowed, twisted, or ended abruptly. It was as though the landscape itself had changed overnight. And then, the unease intensified, the ground beneath our feet was marked, faint depressions forming incomplete arcs that echoed the circle around our tent. I froze. Amy noticed immediately. "You're imagining it," she said quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's just the ground settling, animal tracks, something natural." But it wasn't natural. The arcs mirrored the circle from our campsite, subtle and deliberate, and they repeated at irregular intervals, like someone or something had walked here recently, carefully avoiding detection. A shiver ran through me. Each step we took seemed to deepen the impression that we were being guided, herded, observed. The forest had ceased to feel neutral. It had become a participant in something unseen, a conduit for something patient and deliberate. By noon, the sense of observation had grown oppressive. I realized that the trees themselves seemed to frame our movements, every branch, every shadow an extension of the unseen watcher. Amy stayed close, hands brushing, eyes wide with unspoken fear. Neither of us spoke of what we were beginning to suspect, that the circle had not been random, that the footprints were not a prank, that the forest had its own will, and we had trespassed into it. As we returned toward the clearing in the late afternoon, the mist had thickened, reducing visibility to a few yards. And there it was again, a partial arc of footprints ahead, incomplete, leading toward the tent. We hadn't heard them form, hadn't seen the maker, yet the earth bore the evidence. My throat tightened. Every rational explanation failed, every instinct screamed that we were being watched, tested, perhaps hunted. The forest felt alive with intention, patient and silent, moving around us in ways we could barely perceive. We reached the tent as twilight descended. The circle was unchanged, yet I noticed subtle alterations, tiny impressions that hadn't been there before, indentations deeper than ours, perfectly spaced. Amy stared at them, breathing shallow. I felt a weight pressing down on my chest, a pressure that made every rational thought slip away. Something had been here while we were gone. Something had walked in measured, deliberate steps around our sleeping forms once more. And I knew, with the certainty of dread, that the forest had not yet finished with us. We left the clearing that afternoon with heavy steps and heavy hearts, hoping to find a road, a path, any sign of other people. But the forest refused to relent. Every trail we took twisted unexpectedly, leading us in subtle circles, returning us toward the clearing without our noticing. The air grew colder as shadows deepened. Mist clung to every tree, curling around branches like pale fingers. I felt the same oppressive awareness that had haunted us the morning we found the circle. The forest had not forgotten us. It was waiting. By evening, desperation settled in. Our supplies were low, and the sun was slipping behind the dense canopy, casting the world in dim gray light. We set up camp again near a stream, a place where water promised some semblance of security. Amy worked silently, efficiently, yet I could sense her anxiety, palpable in the tightness of her movements, the quick glances over her shoulder. I tried to reassure her, forcing casual remarks, but my own pulse thumped with a rhythm I could not slow. Night fell quickly, the forest absorbing light and warmth with a strange efficiency, leaving us in a shroud of mist and shadow. We had no fire, the logs were damp, the kindling soaked with evening dew. The stillness pressed in on all sides, and every rustle, every snapping twig set nerves on edge. I tried to focus on something mundane, my breathing, the feel of the ground beneath my fingers, the occasional splash of water in the stream. But awareness of the unseen watcher was relentless, creeping along the periphery of perception. And then we noticed the footprints. A perfect circle, larger than our own boots, encircling the tent. They hadn't been there when we arrived. I froze, heart hammering, stomach twisting. Amy gasped softly, clutching my sleeve. Each print was deliberate, spaced evenly, the steps impossibly measured. Some were elongated, the shape vaguely human but subtly wrong, almost grotesque in proportion. I bent down to examine them, feeling my fingers tremble. The earth bore no other disturbance, no broken twigs, no stray leaves displaced, only the prints, precise, complete, and encircling us like a trap. We didn't see anyone, Amy whispered, voice tight. No one came here. Not a sound. I nodded, though I knew she was right. No one had approached. No animal could have made these prints, the spacing, the symmetry, the perfect placement. Nothing in nature moved like that. The realization settled in my chest like cold stone. The circle had formed while we slept. Something had been here, moving carefully, deliberately, around us, unseen. We tried to rationalize again, wind shifting the tent, the ground sinking, but every explanation faltered. These footprints were too exact, too intentional. A creeping panic gnawed at my thoughts. I remembered the previous night, the strange quiet, the sense of being observed, the subtle pressure that pressed against my skull as if eyes were watching from every direction. And now, with the circle complete once more, I realized the pressure hadn't been imagined. It had been a warning, a preliminary measure, a testing of boundaries. We huddled together inside the tent, breathing shallow, listening. The forest remained silent except for the distant murmur of the stream, yet every sound was magnified in our minds. Every twig snap, every rustle of leaves sent pulses of terror through our veins. We spoke in whispers, plotting escape, considering the roads we might take. But the forest seemed to resist. Every path we recalled led only deeper into shadow, deeper into mist. It was as though the forest itself were alive, directing our steps, shaping the night around us. Hours passed without incident, yet sleep was impossible. I kept my eyes on the tent walls, straining for movement, straining for signs of intrusion. The circle outside remained a presence, an imprint in the soil that radiated intent. I realized that the forest, or whatever had made the footprints, was not simply observing. It was communicating, testing, learning. Our survival depended on more than vigilance. It depended on understanding something we couldn't yet grasp. Eventually, exhaustion forced a fitful sleep, dozing in intervals, heart hammering at every imagined sound. When dawn came, pale and cold, I forced myself out of the tent. The circle had changed. New prints had appeared, slightly larger, slightly closer to the tent than before. They had not been visible in the dim light, and yet here they were, fresh, deliberate, silent. I traced them with my fingers, reluctant, fascinated, horrified. The message was unmistakable. We were being watched, tested, contained. Amy stayed close, silent, her eyes white with fear. We packed quickly, moving with an urgency born of instinct rather than plan. But even as we stepped away from the circle, I felt it, the weight, the intent, the awareness. We had survived the first night, but the forest, and whatever moved within it, had made its presence undeniable. And I understood then, in a deep, primal way, that this was only the beginning. By the fourth night, exhaustion had dulled our initial sense of adventure, replaced by a bone-deep unease that neither of us could shake. Every step we took seemed measured by unseen eyes, every movement tracked and judged. The forest no longer felt neutral. It had become a living labyrinth, its branches and shadows conspiring to manipulate us, folding paths into loops, erasing traces we tried to leave. Even the river we had once followed now twisted inexplicably, carrying us deeper into the dense woods we had meant to leave behind. We set up camp again in a small clearing, though neither of us spoke about the prince at first. We ate sparingly, our hands shaking slightly, muscles tense from constant vigilance. Darkness came quickly, and the familiar shiver of dread returned, wrapping around us like cold fingers. I kept checking the perimeters, my flashlight sweeping across the trees, the bracken, every shadow. The mist was thick tonight, curling unnaturally at our feet, thickening in arcs, drifting in ways that no wind could account for. Hours passed in silence. The forest was still, yet the oppressive awareness persisted. And then we heard it, soft, deliberate steps circling the tent, accompanied by faint impressions in the ground, brushing against leaves, barely perceptible but unmistakable. Amy clutched my arm, wide-eyed. "It's back," she whispered, voice trembling. I nodded, unable to speak, unable to argue. The circle had returned, and it had come while we were awake, while we had thought ourselves vigilant. I turned on my flashlight, scanning the immediate clearing. The beam revealed nothing beyond the tent, yet I felt the pressure again, a tangible weight pressing at the edges of perception, a sensation that was neither wind nor sound. My rational mind faltered. We had left a cleared area, one we thought we controlled, but the prints formed around us, each step deliberate, each angle perfect, as though the earth itself had been manipulated by a precise, intelligent hand. Amy shook, whispering, Do you see them?" Her gaze darted toward the outer edges of the clearing. I squinted into the mist, seeing only vague shapes, but then the shapes moved, or at least seemed to move in our mind's eye. Every shadow elongated, contracted, shifted in ways that contradicted the light. I realized that perception itself was being altered. The forest was not only a place of trees and earth, it was a conduit, a vessel through which something patient, deliberate, and incomprehensible reached out to us. We huddled together inside the tent, listening as the footsteps circled outside, deliberate, echoing in time with our own rapid heartbeats. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, a falling branch, an animal, but every instinct told me otherwise. The movements were too measured, too precise. They formed a perfect, silent choreography around our sleeping space, a test, a ritual, a boundary being enforced. I realized we were not merely observed, we were being contained. Suddenly, a soft scrape sounded against the tent fabric, as if claws or fingernails had grazed the outer surface. Amy screamed softly, clutching me. I froze, breath caught, flashlight shaking in my hand. The mist thickened, seeping closer, curling under the edges of the tent, carrying with it a cold, penetrating chill. The circle was no longer just in the soil, it extended into the air, into the space surrounding us, and we were trapped within its measured bounds. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time became unreliable, stretching and compressing as we remained immobilized, unable to leave, unable to summon rational thought. The prints remained visible outside whenever our gaze faltered, impossibly fresh, impossibly deliberate. And then I realized something far worse. The circle was not just a boundary, it was a predator, a living measure of our vulnerability. The forest had waited, and now it had us in its power. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray, I forced myself out of the tent first. The footprints were unchanged, yet the ground held subtle new impressions, faint arcs suggesting a careful study, a recalibration of whatever intelligence moved among the trees. Amy joined me silently, fear etched deep into her features. The forest was still alive, still observing, still deliberate. And we had survived the night not by courage, but by exhaustion and the simple passage of time. I realized then that flight was futile. The forest would guide us, manipulate us, contain us. And the circle was its instrument, precise and patient. We could not outrun it. We could not reason it away. We had to understand it or submit. The realization settled in my chest like stone. The watcher was no longer outside the clearing. It was everywhere, in every shadow, in every shifting mist, in every subtle perception. And we were trapped in its design. By the fifth night, exhaustion had pushed us past fear into something more primal. Rational thought had abandoned us, replaced by the cold certainty that we were not simply in a forest, but inside a deliberate design, an intricate trap we could not fully comprehend. Every step we had taken, every decision, had been observed, studied, anticipated. The circle had been drawn, redrawn, as if measuring the limits of our endurance, our resolve, our sanity. And now we understood we could no longer hide. We sat in the tent through the day, the pale sun filtering through thick mist, making the trees look like blurred silhouettes. My eyes never left the edges of the clearing. Amy shivered, wrapped in the thin sleeping bag, trying to avoid imagining shapes that might exist in the periphery. We spoke little, conserving energy, conserving thought, because the forest seemed to absorb not just sound but intention. Every plan, every whispered idea, felt immediately fragile, vulnerable to collapse under the weight of unseen observation. As darkness fell, we prepared to face the inevitable. The circle had formed once again, outside the tent, closer, perfectly measured around our flimsy sanctuary. I grabbed the flashlight, Amy at my side, and together we stepped out into the mist, into the embrace of the forest that now felt like the body of some immense, patient creature. The prints were fresh, too large to belong to any human, elongated and precise, arranged with a meticulous symmetry that made my skin crawl. The weight of the forest pressed down on us, silence dense, as if sound itself had been stolen. I scanned the perimeter, flashlight slicing through mist and shadow. Nothing moved, yet I could feel it, the deliberate pressure, the awareness of a presence that existed just beyond perception. And then I realized the circle was not static. It shifted subtly as we moved, forming again, reforming, guiding us, testing us, always maintaining the perimeter. It was not just around us, it was alive, responsive, a shape that existed in the space between thought and perception, enforcing itself with patient insistence. Amy's voice trembled. We can't just stay here." I nodded, breath visible in the cold air. We had to act, to break the rhythm, to deny whatever intelligence moved within the forest. I remembered something from our first morning, the sense that the circle had appeared only when we were passive, asleep, unobservant. Activity, movement, and awareness seemed to diminish its power. If we refused to comply, refused to yield, maybe we could escape. We began to move in deliberate steps, breaking the perimeter in small, calculated arcs, stepping precisely where the earth was undisturbed. The prints shifted in response, elongating, condensing, always adjusting. My pulse thumped in time with our careful movements. Every nerve was taut, every sound was magnified. A soft rustle echoed behind us, leaves brushing leaves, but I refused to look. Rational thought was useless. Only awareness, only intent, only refusal to falter could protect us. Hours passed. We moved in spirals, arcs, deviations, retracing paths, breaking the rhythm of the circle in every way we could imagine. The forest responded, subtly, with the faintest shifts in mist, in shadow, in ambient pressure. Each time I felt the presence tighten, I reminded myself, do not look. Do not hesitate. The circle was a predator, yes, but it fed on fear, hesitation, and awe. Deny it these things, and it weakened. When dawn broke, pale and thin, we reached a ridge overlooking the clearing. The tent below was untouched, yet the circle had dissolved, leaving only faint depressions in the soil that seemed almost tentative, like an afterthought. The forest appeared ordinary, inert, finally neutral. We exhaled, hands clasped, voices raw with relief and disbelief. We had survived. We had broken the ring. I looked back once, toward the dense treeline in the misted clearing, and for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine the circle forming again, waiting for another unwary pair to wander into its meticulous trap. But we were no longer vulnerable. We had learned that awareness and deliberate action were our only shields. And though the memory would haunt us forever, though the prints and the rhythm of the circle would replay in our dreams, we walked away, leaving the forest behind. We returned to civilization slowly, cautiously, but the sense of being observed finally began to fade. Yet the lesson remained: some spaces are alive with intent, some patterns exist beyond reason, and some horrors are patient enough to wait for months, years, or decades. The forest had marked us, tested us, and we had endured. The circle had not claimed us. We had reclaimed our agency, our perception, our lives. And as we drove away, I swore I saw a faint arc of footprints vanish into the mist, a silent warning, a reminder that the forest remembered and that one day, perhaps, the circle would seek new participants. But for now, we survived. For now, the ring was broken. Story 4, The Strange Note. It had been a long day at the office. My heels clicked on the polished floor, echoing through the near-empty lobby, a sound I almost welcomed for its normalcy. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, low and constant, bathing the space in sterile brightness that felt almost comforting after hours of endless meetings and buzzing computers. I gathered my things, straightened my blazer, and checked my phone for messages that, thankfully, weren't there. The day had ended uneventfully. That was, at least, the thought I clung to as I exited the building and walked toward the parking garage. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of wet asphalt and exhaust. I clicked the remote, and my car's headlights blinked twice in acknowledgement. The garage was sparsely populated at this hour. Shadows stretched long from the few vehicles, flickering under the harsh sodium lights above. I felt the usual cautious awareness, checking the few corners, noticing the spaces where darkness pulled unnaturally, but dismissed it as routine paranoia. After all, it was just a parking garage, and I'd walked this path countless times. My keys jangled as I approached the driver's side, a mundane sound that normally signaled the end of a long day. But tonight, something felt off. Something subtle, almost imperceptible, tugged at my awareness, a weight in my chest, a prickle along the nape of my neck. I shook my head, telling myself I was tired, that long days tended to make the mind invent threats. And then I saw it. A small scrap of paper was tucked under my windshield wiper. Crisp and white, it was ordinary in every way except for the words scrawled across it in jagged, hurried handwriting: "Don't look in the back seat." My heart stuttered. I froze, keys in hand, staring at the note as though it were a live thing, capable of snapping at me. Rational thought screamed to call the police, to back away slowly, to treat it as a prank. But instinct, primal and insistent, anchored me to the spot. I couldn't bring myself to move. My eyes, wide and alert, scanned the interior of the car through the glass. The front seats were empty. My bag and jacket rested where I had left them. Nothing unusual. Nothing, yet. I dropped the keys deliberately, letting them clatter against the asphalt. The sound seemed deafening in the quiet garage. My pulse thumped in my ears as I debated my next move. Part of me wanted to run, to leave the car and the note and the inevitable fear behind. But another part, a darker, inexplicable part, wanted to know why, to understand, to confront whatever unseen force had left a message. My fingers trembled as I reached for the door handle. I froze again. Rationality and dread collided. What if it was a warning? What if someone was already inside, lurking, waiting for me to obey the note's command? My chest tightened, a pressure that made it difficult to draw a full breath. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, casting the garage in brief, disorienting darkness. I blinked, shaking my head, convincing myself that it was just the old bulbs. Still, The note remained there, an impossible, tangible command that refused to be ignored. I took a step back, calculating. My mind raced through scenarios: a prank, a message meant for someone else, a psychological game. Each possibility collided with the others, none comforting, all leaving me with an acute sense of vulnerability. I reached for my phone, hands shaking, and considered calling someone, anyone, but the logical step felt impossible. I couldn't explain the fear, the weight in my chest, the suffocating awareness that I wasn't truly alone. Finally, I forced my breathing to slow. Rational thought dictated a methodical approach. I moved to the passenger side, crouching low, scanning the interior through the glass. Nothing. The front seat was as empty as it should be. My bag and coat sat undisturbed, yet the sense of being watched prickled along my skin. And then, almost imperceptibly, a shadow shifted in the rearview mirror. I froze. My eyes locked on the back seat. There was nothing there, at least, nothing immediately visible. But the instinct, screaming at me, told me the note was no joke. The warning was precise. Don't look. Every nerve in my body wanted to obey, to avert my gaze, to leave the garage as fast as possible. But the human mind, stubborn and insistent, refused simple obedience. I needed to know. Slowly, painfully, I reached for the driver's side door. My reflection stared back at me from the window, pale and wide-eyed, heart hammering audibly against my ribs. I hesitated, hand hovering over the handle. The shadow in the mirror twitched. My throat went dry. Rationality faltered. Dread filled the space between thought and action. I took a single, careful step back. The note fluttered slightly in the breeze from the garage ventilation, as if it had awareness of my hesitation. My phone vibrated in my pocket, though I hadn't set it to alert. The suddenness made me jump. Each sound was magnified, every shift of light in the garage a threat. The note remained simple, insistent: don't look in the back seat. And the word "don't" pulsed in my mind like a command I could not ignore. For a long moment, I stood frozen, caught between rational explanation and pure terror. And then I realized something undeniable. The warning was real. Someone, something, had been here. And whether I looked or not, the presence remained. The back seat held a secret, a threat, and my hesitation made me complicit in whatever game had begun. The ordinary had transformed into something malignant, the familiar into a stage for unseen forces. I stepped back further, resolving to leave, knowing that every second of delay strengthened whatever watched. And yet the note, with its simple command, burned in my mind, a reminder that the danger was patient, deliberate, and unseen. My pulse thundered as I debated, should I obey, or confront the unknown? Every instinct screamed at me, every rational thought argued for leaving. I realized then, in the quiet, suffocating air of the garage, that one way or another, the night would demand an answer. I didn't sleep well that night, though I forced myself to go home. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the note, crisp and white, lodged under the wiper like a warning carved into reality. The words repeated in my mind, "Don't look in the back seat." The repetition gnawed at me, an invisible itch I could not scratch. Rational thought tried to soothe me. It was a prank. Someone wanted to scare me. Someone watched my routine. But the visceral dread, lodged in the base of my skull and sinking into my chest, refused logic. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that the night had passed uneventfully. I parked the car in the same spot, glanced briefly at the wipers, and saw nothing unusual. The note was gone, probably discarded by the wind, someone cleaning up a prank. My heartbeat slowed. Relief, faint and fragile, eased some tension. Yet, as I drove to work, I couldn't shake the sense of being observed. Mirrors reflected ordinary streets, ordinary cars, yet shadows in my peripheral vision seemed to linger, thicker than they should have been, stretching across asphalt, curving unnaturally. I tried to work. The office felt normal, mundane, fluorescent lit and alive with chatter. Yet the image of the note remained in the corners of my mind, a flickering presence in every reflective surface. Windows, my phone screen, the chrome of the coffee machine. I found myself checking doors, glancing at coworkers with suspicion, imagining them pausing, watching, judging. The ordinary was contaminated by dread. Rational thought struggled to dominate, but the fear refused to loosen its grip. By evening, I convinced myself to return to the car, telling myself that I needed closure, some sense of control over the lingering anxiety. I left the office with purpose, ignoring small, fleeting worries, focusing on steps, counting them, marking distance, forcing rationality to override instinct. The garage was quiet again, almost too quiet, each echo of my heels amplified unnaturally. I reached my car and stopped. There it was. A faint smear on the rear window, almost imperceptible under the fluorescent glare, the exact spot that corresponded with the back seat. I swallowed hard, forcing my gaze away. The note wasn't there this time, but the implication was identical. Someone or something had been inside the car, or had intended to be. Rationality suggested an animal, a prankster, a wind-blown remnant of yesterday. But instinct screamed otherwise. The car was locked. I had the keys. The doors hadn't been tampered with. And yet the warning had returned in a more insidious form, a subtle trace that said, unmistakably, look carefully, or you'll regret it. My hand shook as I opened the driver's side door, the familiar smell of leather and faint perfume from my own belongings a thin barrier against terror. I seated myself, heart hammering, every nerve alert. Rational explanations whirled, drafts, reflections, condensation, scratches from previous wear. But none of these accounted for the visceral, unshakable certainty that someone or something was present, that the back seat held the focus of its intent. My breath came shallow, rapid, each exhale like an admission of vulnerability. I considered calling someone, anyone, but the thought of describing the note, the back seat, the oppressive awareness, sounded absurd. What would I say? There's a warning on my car, and I think someone's inside it? I would sound insane. Rational thought faltered entirely. Only raw instinct remained. I tried to convince myself to leave immediately, to abandon the car, abandon everything, but the rational need to know battled against the primal urge to flee. The rearview mirror caught my eye, reflecting the interior of the car. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw movement, a shadow, subtle, shifting across the back seat. My pulse spiked, fingers tightening around the steering wheel. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to rationalize. There was nothing there. It had to be a trick of light, a reflection of the garage's fluorescent bulbs on the glass. It had to. But every instinct screamed at me not to turn around fully, not to glance backward, not to disturb whatever was lurking just beyond immediate perception. Minutes passed. I remained in the car, frozen, aware of every sound, every shift in air, every subtle change in shadow. And then the hairs on my neck stood on end. A faint scent reached me, iron, cold and metallic, impossible to attribute to the environment, something out of place, something deliberate. The air felt heavier near the back seat. Rationality crumbled. Every nerve screamed, it is there. It is waiting. I did not move, did not breathe, did not look. The warning had been explicit, and compliance seemed the only buffer between control and chaos. Finally, I opened the door with trembling hands, moving with careful, deliberate steps, avoiding the back seat entirely. I circled to the front, determined to break the spell without confrontation. The shadow remained in my mind, intangible yet insistent, pressing into my awareness. Every rational explanation I tried, wind, prank, reflection, imagination, crumbled under the raw intensity of dread. And when I stepped away from the car, my gaze never straying to the rear, I realized the warning had not been random. It was targeted, precise, and I had survived only by obeying. The garage, now empty, echoed with the faint hum of the ventilation system. I hurried to my apartment, refusing to look back, yet carrying the undeniable certainty that the warning was real. Something had been present in my car, something patient and deliberate, something unseen. And it was waiting. The following day, I tried to reclaim normalcy. Rationality demanded it. I drove to work, parked in a different garage, and forced my mind onto spreadsheets, emails, and mundane tasks. Yet the shadow of the note, and the presence behind it, lingered in the corners of my awareness. Every reflective surface, the chrome handle of my coffee mug, the polished office floor, the window facing the street seemed to contain a hidden threat. I caught myself checking the car in the distance multiple times, heart leaping whenever I imagined movement inside. By evening, I knew avoidance wasn't enough. I needed to confront the fear, or at least prove to myself that it was irrational. I returned to my usual garage, despite every instinct screaming to avoid it. The fluorescent lights buzzed, low and uneven. Shadows pulled in corners, elongating unnaturally along the walls. I felt watched before even reaching the car, my pulse quickening, every step taut with expectation. The note was gone. That much was normal. But the back seat still held its silent, oppressive promise. I approached slowly, heart hammering, every step deliberate. I refused to look inside directly, keeping my gaze fixed on the steering wheel, the dashboard, the ground immediately in front of me. Yet instinct betrayed me. A subtle movement in the rearview mirror made my stomach twist. It was almost imperceptible, a flicker, a shifting shadow that mirrored my own hesitation. My breath caught. Rationality sputtered. I debated my next move for what felt like eternity. My phone trembled in my hand, fingers wrapped around it, the thought of calling someone, anyone, almost unbearable. And then, a soft, scraping whisper, like fingernails brushing leather, came from the back seat. My blood froze. Rationality had no words for this. I had not moved it, touched it, or opened it, yet the sound was there. The car, once mundane and familiar, had become a conduit for something patient, deliberate, and unseen. I realized the note was more than a warning. It was a test, a marker of boundaries. Every instinct told me to obey, yet human curiosity burned hotter than reason. I had to know what I was being warned against. Trembling, I took a step closer, fingertips brushing the driver's door, careful to keep my gaze away from the back. Another subtle shift, a flicker of darkness in the corner of my vision, tightened the vice of terror around my chest. I considered leaving entirely, but hesitation had become a luxury I could not afford. The presence was patient, calculating. Every second I debated, every heartbeat, every cautious movement was recorded, analyzed, gauging my reaction. I realized then that the unseen force was intelligent. Not random. Not a prank or a trick of light. Deliberate, methodical, waiting for me to cross the threshold of fear or defiance. Finally, I made my choice. I opened the driver's side door, keeping my body angled so that my back faced the rear seat only partially. The air inside the car felt heavier, almost viscous, carrying a faint metallic scent that made my stomach lurch. I could feel the shadow pressing against the edges of my perception, a constant, weighty presence that didn't move but existed, filled the space with intent. My pulse thundered. I wanted to retreat, to slam the door, to run screaming into the night. Yet I forced myself to sit, hands trembling on the wheel, refusing to look behind me. Minutes passed. The air shifted. The faint rustle of fabric, the subtle scent of iron, intensified, pressing me into the seat, making every rational thought crumble. My mind began to fracture under the weight of uncertainty. I imagined shapes in the corners, imagined movement I could not verify, each flicker feeding the terror. And then I realized the presence didn't need to act physically. Its power was psychological. The note, the warning, the back seat, these were instruments. Fear itself was the weapon, and I was caught in the precise focus of it. I left the car trembling, never looking directly at the back seat, never daring to glance in the mirrors. The presence remained patient and unseen, a constant force that had tested and measured me. Every rational explanation, wind, prank, imagination had failed. And I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that the note had not been a one-time warning. It was a game, a trial, and the unseen observer would continue to measure, to test, to manipulate. I drove away slowly, heart hammering, hands clutching the wheel. The city lights did little to dispel the oppressive certainty that I was being watched, followed and thought if not embodied. Rationality whispered that I had escaped the immediate danger, yet instinct, primal and insistent, told me the game was not over. And as I glanced once at the rearview mirror, careful not to let my eyes linger, I felt it, a cold awareness, a lingering intent just beyond the visible, waiting for the next step in the night. I should have left it alone. That thought repeated in my head, desperate, urgent, as I parked in my usual lot after work. I told myself I was prepared this time, rational, cautious. But caution only delayed what was inevitable. The note had returned, not literally, not yet, but its presence manifested in subtle ways. The faint metallic scent, the shifting shadows, the oppressive weight in the air whenever I approached my car. I could feel it waiting for me, patient and deliberate, an intelligence that didn't need eyes to see. The garage was nearly empty, quiet except for the low hum of fluorescent lights. I gripped my keys tightly, knuckles white, and approached the car with shallow breaths. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave this vehicle behind, to abandon whatever compulsion had drawn me here. But curiosity, that dangerous human trait, burned hotter than fear. I had to know. I had to confront it. I unlocked the driver's side door, stepping in carefully, angling my body to avoid directly facing the back seat. The air inside was cold, thicker than outside, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach twist. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. The presence was palpable, something patient, intelligent, existing in the space just beyond perception, pressing against my awareness. Rationality faltered. Every sound, every flicker of light, every shadow in the corner of my vision made my pulse leap. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Nothing appeared. And yet I felt its awareness, like a pressure, a weight, something alive yet formless pressing against the edges of my consciousness. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was imagination, that the mind exaggerates fear, that there was no one, nothing. But the instinct, the raw, primal sense lodged in the pit of my stomach, screamed otherwise. I had to move closer. Slowly, trembling, I adjusted in the seat, hands hovering over the gear shift, forcing my body to face the back seat only partially. That's when I saw it, or rather, sensed it. The space behind me seemed to deepen, shadows pooling unnaturally, the light twisting in ways that contradicted physics. A subtle rustle, like the brushing of fabric, came from the back seat. My pulse jumped. I wanted to flee, to slam the door, to run screaming, but something rooted me to the seat. The warning had never been clearer. It wanted me aware, fearful, compliant. I considered leaving the car entirely, but the presence reacted instantly. The metallic tang intensified, pressing against my senses, filling my nostrils, making each breath a conscious effort. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, where I glimpsed, just for a heartbeat, a dark shape, impossible to define, yet unmistakably there. Rational thought dissolved. My mind scrambled for explanations, prank, reflection, hallucination, wind. None sufficed. The reality of the presence was undeniable. Then it moved. Not like a person, not with feet or hands, but the space itself shifted. The back seat seemed to contract, a darkness pooling just behind the leather upholstery. My skin crawled. I could feel something brushing against my consciousness, testing boundaries, waiting for me to panic. Every muscle tensed. I realized, with the absolute clarity of terror, that the warning, "Don't look in the back seat," had been a command born of necessity. Compliance was the only buffer between control and immediate danger. I backed out of the driver's seat slowly, deliberately, never meeting the back seat with my gaze. The air remained heavy, almost viscous, the metallic tang lingering, the pressure unyielding. I opened the door fully, sliding out carefully, stepping onto the cold asphalt. The presence did not follow but remained, concentrated, patient, waiting for the next opportunity to assert its dominion. I hurried away from the car, never daring to glance back, aware that its awareness had not diminished. Shaking, I called a friend to pick me up. I didn't want to describe the note, the shadows, or the metallic scent. Sounding sane felt impossible, but the urgency in my voice conveyed it. As I waited under the pale glow of the garage lights, I felt the oppressive presence of the back seat behind me, patient, deliberate, relentless. It hadn't attacked. Not yet. It had tested, measured, ensured compliance, and left me alive, but aware. As the car door slammed shut when my friend arrived, I felt something shift inside. The metallic tang dissipated slightly, the oppressive weight lifted, but the intelligence remained. Somewhere in the darkness of that vehicle, something waited. Patient, deliberate, and exact. And I understood then that this was no ordinary threat. It did not need to act immediately. Fear itself was the weapon, and I had been its subject. We left the garage quickly. My car remained behind, doors locked, lights dimmed, mundane from the outside, yet carrying a presence impossible to quantify. The note, the warning, the back seat, these were instruments, tools of control. And as we drove away, I realized the ordeal had not ended. It had only been delayed. The intelligence, whatever it was still there, and it had observed every choice I had made. But I survived. For now. The next night, I did not sleep. I stayed in a friend's apartment, the lights on, windows locked, phone on the table within reach. Rationality tried to soothe me. The car remained in the garage, distant, inert, and I was safe. But the note and its warning lingered, an echo in the corners of my mind, insistent, patient, impossible to ignore. The presence had been deliberate, measured, but now I realized it was not passive. It had assessed my compliance, gauged my fear, and was waiting for a moment of vulnerability. Unable to resist, I checked my phone compulsively. Every alert, every message felt like a test. Every silence, a calculated pressure. And then I saw it, a new message from an unknown number, simple, stark, typed in plain text. "You looked once. You're ready." My stomach dropped. Rationality faltered entirely. The phrase was unmistakable. The presence had followed me, or had never left, waiting, observing, marking my every hesitation. I knew then that avoidance was futile. I could not outrun it. I could not rationalize it away. I had to confront it. Reluctantly, trembling, I returned to my car. The garage was empty, lights flickering low, shadows pooling unnaturally along walls and corners. My heart thundered. The metallic tang I had sensed before was faint but unmistakable, brushing against my awareness. I gripped the keys, hands shaking, and unlocked the driver's side. The air inside was thick, heavy, oppressive, yet quiet. I sat, breathing shallowly, refusing to look into the back seat. Minutes passed in tense stillness. The car, ordinary in appearance, carried an invisible weight, a presence that seemed to press against perception itself. And then I felt it, unmistakable, a subtle shift, a movement from the back seat, just enough to ripple through my senses without visual confirmation. My chest tightened. Fear became a tangible entity, coiling around me, threading through my nerves. Rational thought offered no explanation. Logic had abandoned me. I realized the note had not been a warning, it had been a choice, a test of obedience, a measure of survival. I knew I had to act, and instinct guided me. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for my phone. I dialed a friend, my voice shaking, whispering the most basic instructions. Come now, hurry, don't question. Every second stretched, every heartbeat pounding in my ears, as if the car itself measured my hesitation. And then the movement became more deliberate. The air in the back seemed to thicken, a shadow pooling along the edges of the seat. I could not see it, but I felt it, alive and patient, responding to every decision, every tremor of fear. My friend arrived within minutes, though they seemed unnaturally late. I barely waited for the door to swing open. I stepped out, refusing to look back, dragging the weight of awareness with me. The back seat remained silent, yet unmistakably present. My friend jumped into the driver's seat as I slid into the passenger side. The metallic tang lingered faintly, the oppressive weight easing slightly as the engine hummed to life. We drove away. The lights of the city grew behind us, normality creeping in with distance. I dared to glance at the rearview mirror, empty, mundane, ordinary. The presence had not followed in a physical sense. Yet in the pit of my stomach, in the tense chords of my nerves, I knew it had observed, measured, and marked me. The note, the warning, the back seat, it was not bound by geography. It was patient, intelligent, deliberate. And though I had survived, I could not deny its power. We reached my apartment, doors locking behind us, lights blazing. I told myself, over and over, that the car remained in the garage, that the presence could not breach walls or distance. Rational thought tried to hold sway, but instinct whispered warnings I could not ignore. I would sleep, eventually. I would wake, eventually. And the memory of that night, the metallic tang, the weight, the warning, don't look in the back seat, would never leave. I survived, yes. But survival did not erase knowledge. It did not remove the understanding that some presences wait patiently, observing, calculating, choosing the exact moment to act. The note had been the first step, the warning, the measure of control. I had obeyed, and in doing so, I had lived. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it would not forget. And the back seat remained. Story 5, The Woodsman. We had been driving for hours, the rhythm of the tires on asphalt hypnotic, the hum of the engine blending with the low murmur of my parents' voices in the front seat. The sun had already dipped behind the trees, and night settled into the forest along the winding road like a slow, creeping shadow. My younger brother, Tom, leaned against the window, eyes half closed, breathing in shallow, uneven patterns, while I stared out into the thickening darkness, trying to make sense of the endless green blur of trees illuminated by passing headlights. The air inside the car was stale but safe, a cocoon of ordinary sensations. We laughed occasionally, our voices bouncing against the interior, small and mundane sounds that made the isolation of the forest almost bearable. Mom hummed softly, Dad adjusted the radio, static creeping between stations, occasionally filling the car with bursts of tinny music. The night was calm, ordinary, unremarkable. That calm, I would later realize, was the precursor to its collapse. The first sign that something was off came as a subtle vibration in the steering wheel. At first, I ignored it, convinced it was just the road, a minor irregularity in the asphalt. Dad frowned, muttering about the tires. We slowed slightly, careful, scanning the lanes for debris or potholes. The vibration increased, subtle thumps in rhythm with the engine, yet irregular enough to unsettle me. I tried to focus on my homework, pencil scratching on paper, but the scratch of graphite sounded far too loud, far too intrusive in the otherwise quiet interior. And then it happened. The engine shuddered violently, a deep, clanging cough that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the car. Dad cursed softly, swearing under his breath. The car lurched to the side, tires skidding against gravel at the road's edge. Mom gasped, her hand tightening on the dashboard, and I felt Tom's small body stiffen beside me. The familiar, ordinary hum of the car became a growl of metal and distress, and I realized, in the pit of my stomach, that we were no longer in control. Dad guided the car to the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath the tires, headlights illuminating the dark, towering trees on either side. He turned off the engine, the sudden silence deafening. For a moment, we simply sat, enveloped by the night and the thick smell of pine, my pulse pounding so loudly I could almost hear it echoing off the metal of the dashboard. My hands gripped the seat, knuckles white, and I swallowed hard, trying to suppress the first creeping tendrils of unease. "I'll check the engine," Dad said, voice calm but strained. He stepped out, the door slamming lightly, leaving us alone inside the car. The headlights illuminated nothing but black shadows between trees, the forest pressing close, dark and impenetrable. Mom and Tom exchanged worried glances, and I felt the ordinary safety of the vehicle shrink into something fragile, impermanent, as if the car itself were a temporary haven from the vast, unknowable dark beyond. I tried to focus on rational explanations, maybe a broken belt, a loose spark plug, something reparable. But the forest seemed to press closer, the shadows shifting unnaturally as the night deepened. The breeze stirred the branches, making them scrape and whisper against one another, a low, rhythmic scratching that mimicked hushed voices. I flinched, imagining shapes moving just beyond the headlights' reach, but the familiar landscape offered no clarity, only suggestions, faint and unsettling. Minutes dragged. Dad's voice drifted occasionally, muffled, distorted, asking about tools, cursing the stubborn engine, and then silence again. That silence was heavier than darkness, dense and deliberate, almost sentient. My pulse quickened. Tom whimpered softly, breaking the spell of routine we had relied on. Mom reached for him, her touch brief but grounding, yet even in that moment, I felt the forest's presence beyond the car, an awareness that was patient and waiting. I glanced out the side window, my eyes adjusting to the deepening gloom. That's when I saw it, first at the edge of the headlight's reach, then stepping closer, emerging from the trees. A man, tall, impossibly still, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the shadows. He wasn't moving in any hurried or obvious way. He simply stood there, watching, unblinking, as if waiting for the perfect moment to close the distance between us. My breath caught. Rational thoughts scrambled. Maybe a lost traveler, maybe someone looking for help. But every instinct screamed at me that he was wrong, that his presence was deliberate, that the forest itself had delivered him. I froze, heart hammering, and whispered, "Dad, someone's out there." Mom leaned forward, peering through the windshield, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. Tom whimpered again, clutching at her arm. The man did not move closer, yet the forest seemed to shift around him, shadows elongating, pressing inward. The ordinary had dissolved. The night, the trees, the road, all were no longer neutral. They conspired to isolate us, to trap us in this widening orbit of awareness and dread. I wanted to scream, to leap out of the car, to demand explanations, but the rational voice in my head reminded me that opening the door could be fatal. I glanced at Mom, whose face was pale, tense, lips pressed tight. Dad's figure remained at the hood, half illuminated, moving sluggishly as if the engine's issues had slowed him more than they should have. And the man remained still, patient, deliberate, observing, waiting, an intruder in a place where we had assumed safety. That night, the forest had become something more than trees and shadows. The ordinary had warped into menace. And the man, standing there in silence, was no longer just a stranger. He was the first herald of the dark intelligence that would define the hours to come, a presence that had waited for our car to falter, for our vulnerability to manifest. We were not alone. Dad didn't react immediately when I called out from the car. He muttered something under his breath and continued fiddling with the hood, tools clinking against metal in the dim light. The stranger didn't move. He stood perfectly still, barely a shadow against the dense darkness of the trees, yet every instinct in my body screamed that he was aware of us, aware of every small movement inside the car. Mom tried to speak softly, coaxing Dad, but her voice sounded fragile, swallowed by the forest around us. Tom had pressed himself against her side, tiny hands clinging to her sweater. The ordinary weight of our vehicle, the engine, the metal, the seats, had once felt protective, but now it seemed flimsy, paper-thin, unable to shield us from what waited in the darkness beyond the headlights. I couldn't take my eyes off him. Something about the way he stood there, like a statue carved from night itself, made the hair on my arms prickle. Rational thought tried to intervene. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he meant no harm. Maybe he'd wait until Dad waved him over. But rationality dissolved into instinct as the seconds stretched. My chest tightened. The air felt heavier, pressing into my lungs. Every breath was measured, shallow, a conscious effort to avoid drawing attention. Suddenly, he lifted his hand, not in greeting, but slowly, deliberately, pointing toward the road behind us. A shiver traveled down my spine. I squinted through the windshield, following the gesture. The road curved into darkness, dense trees on both sides, an endless tunnel that seemed to swallow light. I couldn't see what he was indicating, and that uncertainty was worse than the unknown itself. Dad slammed the hood shut and climbed back into the car, face pale, hands smudged with grease. "Nothing I can do tonight," he muttered, voice low, strained. "We'll call for help in the morning." He tried to sound rational, but I could see the unease in his eyes. The man remained outside, just beyond the reach of the headlights, a sentinel carved from darkness. I whispered to Mom, voice barely audible. Should we go?" "Now!" Her hand gripped mine, her thumb stroking lightly over my knuckles. "We can't," she said softly, though I could hear the tremor in her tone. "It's too dark. We'll wait." I glanced at Tom, sleeping lightly, unaware of the intensity of the threat looming just outside. I hated myself for wanting to protect him while feeling utterly powerless. The stranger didn't move. Time slowed. The forest seemed to lean inward, branches scraping together above the car like whispered voices. I strained to hear any sound beyond the faint rustling of leaves, but nothing came except the occasional drip of condensation from the trees. Yet the sensation of being observed intensified with every passing second. The forest was alive now, every shadow twisting toward the car. The ordinary world had fractured. The road trip we had taken so casually had dissolved into an unrelenting vigilance. Dad finally sighed, leaning back against the seat. He didn't look at the stranger, didn't acknowledge him, but I saw his hands tremble slightly. We were trapped by circumstance, by darkness, and by the calculated stillness of that man who had emerged from nowhere. His eyes, barely discernible in the dim light, seemed to pierce straight into the car, into the space where we cowered in silence. Minutes passed like hours. I counted each second in my head, trying to convince myself that he would leave, that rational explanation would prevail. But deep down, I knew better. His presence was deliberate. He had chosen this night, this forest, this moment to appear. He waited for something, an opening, a misstep, a crack in our fear. Then, without warning, he took a single step forward. Not hurried, not frantic, but with the precision of someone accustomed to being unseen and yet entirely present. The crunch of leaves against the forest floor echoed unnaturally, too loud, too deliberate, like a signal designed to remind us of his control. I flinched, pressing myself against the seat, fingers gripping the upholstery. The ordinary car, once a barrier, now felt like a fragile cage. Mom whispered to Dad, urging caution, but her voice was almost lost in the tension. I dared a glance at her face, pale and tense, and realized that whatever fear we were feeling, he had felt it first. The forest, the shadows, the night itself had all bent toward him. And though he had not touched us, had not crossed the threshold, I could feel the menace radiating from his still form, thick and deliberate. The road stretched behind him, black and unknowable. The forest leaned in. We remained in the car, hearts pounding, waiting, aware that the ordinary rules no longer applied. And all the while, the stranger watched, patient, calculating, waiting for the moment when fear would no longer be enough to contain him. We stayed in the car longer than we should have. Every minute, every breath, stretched into an eternity. The stranger remained at the edge of the headlights, unnervingly still, watching us with patience that felt infinite. The forest had changed around him, shadows twisting unnaturally, trees leaning in subtly toward the road. The ordinary forest we had passed through without notice earlier in the day now seemed complicit, pressing in, isolating us completely from the world beyond. Dad fidgeted with the radio, trying to tune to a station, as if static and meaningless music could mask our situation. I could see his jaw tight, hands trembling slightly on the dashboard. Mom whispered reassurances to Tom, who had curled in on himself, eyes wide and terrified. I had never seen him so small, so vulnerable, and it made my chest tighten with helplessness. Rational thoughts scrambled. Maybe he was lost, maybe he needed help, maybe it wasn't personal. But instinct, that raw, primal sense lodged deep in my gut, told me this was deliberate, targeted. The stranger moved again, a single, deliberate step forward, slow enough to be almost imperceptible, yet precise, each movement calculated. The crunch of leaves sounded like gunfire in the heavy, oppressive silence. The car suddenly felt like an inadequate shell, a fragile barrier between us and a presence that didn't need to speak to control us. I pressed my face to the glass, trying to glimpse details, but his features remained indistinct, blurred by the darkness. And yet, I could feel him watching, calculating every twitch, every tremble, every whispered thought of panic. I wanted to scream, to demand that he explain himself, but the rational voice inside my head warned me otherwise. The car doors remained locked. Windows were up. He could not enter, at least, not yet. But the knowledge of his patience, his deliberate timing, made my skin crawl. The forest itself seemed alive, branches scraping against one another like whispered voices, carrying intent that I could not decipher. Suddenly, he raised his arm. Not a wave, not a signal, but pointing straight at the car. A chill shot through me, a visceral, instinctive terror that made my stomach lurch. I glanced at Mom and Dad. They had noticed too. Fear, unspoken but heavy, settled over all of us. The stranger had chosen the exact moment to demonstrate that control was not an illusion. It was absolute. Dad muttered something, a decision forming in his voice. He grabbed the keys and looked around, scanning the edge of the woods, calculating escape. The stranger, however, moved again, stepping onto the road, closer now, his figure fully illuminated in the headlights. His shadow stretched unnaturally long across the asphalt, reaching toward the car like a tangible thing, distorting reality. The forest behind him seemed darker somehow, denser, swallowing every hint of ordinary terrain we had known. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and insistent, echoing in my ears. My fingers dug into the seat, knuckles white, trembling. The sense of being observed, of being evaluated, intensified. Rational thought tried to break through. Maybe if we drove slowly, maybe if we ignored him, maybe if we called for help, but each option collapsed under the oppressive weight of instinctual terror. The stranger stopped a few meters from the car, facing us, still silent. His presence radiated control, not through movement, but through the deliberate patience of his observation. I realized with dawning horror that he had orchestrated every second of this encounter. The breakdown in the woods, the isolation, the darkness, all were not accidents. They were a stage, and we were the actors, forced to perform under his gaze. Mom whispered to Dad, voice barely audible, urging retreat, escape, some action to reclaim safety. But even as he turned the key in the ignition, the stranger's figure shifted slightly, unnaturally, with intent. The metallic scrape of gravel beneath his boots, or was it gravel, echoed louder than it should, each step deliberate, each sound a message. He wasn't moving quickly, yet the sense of impending proximity was overwhelming, immediate, unavoidable. I realized then that the ordinary rules had dissolved. The road, the car, the forest, even time itself, had become a mechanism to heighten our fear, to measure our compliance, to magnify terror. And as the car lurched forward, engine roaring to life, I caught the faint glint of something in his hand. A blade? A tool? Impossible to discern, yet the reflection of light on metal was unmistakable. He had been waiting for us patiently, deliberately, for precisely this moment. We drove, tires skidding slightly on gravel, headlights piercing the dark trees. The stranger did not chase. He did not run. He remained there, silent, watching, a single figure among infinite shadows. But I knew instinct screamed that this was not the end. He had marked us, claimed the encounter, and his patience suggested that he would return, or that the forest itself might carry his will toward us again. That night, the forest became a memory I could not erase, and the stranger became a specter lodged in my mind. We had survived, yes, but survival did not erase the awareness that someone, something, was out there, deliberate, patient, and infinitely observant. And the thought that he had chosen us, intentionally, for reasons we could not fathom, settled like stone in my chest. We drove slowly at first, tires crunching on the gravel, headlights cutting narrow paths through the dense forest. Dad kept glancing at the rearview mirror, eyes wide, knuckles white on the wheel. Every shadow between the trees seemed alive, twisting unnaturally as if leaning toward us. The stranger had not followed physically, but I could feel his awareness, pressing through the dark like a weight against the air itself. Rational thought offered no comfort. He had engineered this entire encounter, measured every heartbeat, every hesitation. Mom gripped Tom's hand tightly, whispering soft reassurances I could barely hear over the roar of my own pulse. I stared out the windshield, scanning the shadows along the roadside. The forest seemed endless, a black void on either side, and the road stretched in distorted lines that made each turn feel uncertain, unfamiliar. The ordinary landmarks of civilization, streetlights, signs, guardrails, were absent. We were completely isolated, vulnerable. Then I saw him. Not in the road, not physically, but in the periphery of the headlights, a subtle movement, almost imperceptible. The branches behind him shifted, bending with impossible precision, and I realized with a shiver that he had stepped onto a parallel path, moving alongside the road without making a sound. My stomach churned. He had closed the distance without our noticing. "Dad, he's following us," I whispered, voice tight, almost a breath. Mom's hand clenched mine, pulling me closer, her own fear mirrored in the tremor of her grip. Dad's jaw tightened. "Drive," he muttered, voice low and urgent. "Just drive. Don't stop." We accelerated, tires skidding on loose gravel. The stranger maintained his position, a shadow just beyond the trees, moving with impossible patience, matching our speed without any obvious effort. The forest seemed to respond to him, the darkness thickened, shadows elongating unnaturally to obscure his form, yet somehow I could sense his presence in every reflected glimmer, every subtle rustle of leaves. He was patient, deliberate, waiting for a single misstep. My throat felt dry. My hands gripped the seat as tightly as Dad gripped the wheel. I tried to focus on rational thought, but every instinct screamed that we had underestimated him. This was no ordinary man. The forest itself had become a weapon in his hands, a living extension of his will. And as we rounded a bend, I caught a flash of movement in the trees, something darker than shadow, flickering with impossible speed, and my heart leapt into my throat. Dad swerved slightly to avoid a tree root or rock, I couldn't tell, but the car lurched, and in that instant, I realized the danger was no longer theoretical. The stranger had closed the gap completely, a phantom stalking us with inhuman precision. A low, metallic scraping echoed faintly, not from behind but from the sides, as if the forest itself had teeth. My pulse pounded so loudly I thought it would burst from my chest. Faster, Dad shouted. Tires skidded on gravel, headlights flashing, illuminating the blackened trunks in brief bursts. And then I saw it, the glint again, sharp, reflective metal in his hand, catching the light as he moved parallel to the car. It wasn't random, every movement was measured, deliberate, controlled. My stomach lurched. This was no longer a warning. This was a hunt. Mom whispered frantic prayers, her voice almost drowned out by the engine's roar and the oppressive darkness pressing from the trees. Tom whimpered, clutching at her shoulder, small hands trembling. I realized that fear had become our tether, the lifeline between survival and disaster. Every instinct screamed to obey, to flee, to survive. And yet rational thought was impossible. The ordinary rules of road and distance no longer applied. We rounded another bend, and the forest narrowed, branches scraping against the car as though testing the strength of its shell. I glimpsed him again in the periphery, closer now, impossibly close, shadowed yet tangible, the metallic glint unmistakable. Panic surged. Dad's foot pressed harder on the accelerator. Gravel sprayed behind us. I pressed my face against the passenger window, trying to make sense of the impossible. The stranger's patience had evolved into pursuit, deliberate and inescapable. Minutes or hours, I couldn't tell, passed in a blur of motion, shadows, and raw, unfiltered fear. Then, abruptly, the trees thinned. Ahead, a faint glow of road lights. Civilization. Relief surged, but instinct warned me the presence would not relent simply because we approached safety. He had tested, measured, and now he had tracked us to the edge of his design. The car broke onto the paved road, tires screeching slightly as the gravel gave way, and I realized with grim certainty that escape was within reach, but not guaranteed. The stranger slowed, stopping at the edge of the forest. The metallic glint vanished, the shadows folding back into the trees. He did not step forward. He did not disappear entirely. He waited, patient, deliberate, watching us retreat into the light. My chest heaved with relief, but a cold certainty settled into my bones. We had survived the immediate danger, yes, but the intelligence behind the man, the deliberate orchestration of the night, had not relented. It had measured, marked, and claimed our encounter. And I knew, even as streetlights illuminated our trembling faces, that the forest, the stranger, and the darkness itself had not forgotten. The glow of streetlights was a fragile comfort, but I clung to it desperately as we drove. The forest receded behind us, dark and impenetrable, yet every instinct in my body screamed that it still watched. The stranger had not followed physically, but his presence, the weight of his patience, the deliberate control lingered in our minds like a shadow too persistent to shake. Dad kept glancing in the rearview mirror, pale and tense, hands tight on the wheel. Every now and then, I thought I saw a flicker in the tree line, a dark shape that mirrored our movement, but each time it dissolved into branches and night. We reached the main road, lights brighter, traffic sparse but real. The sound of other cars, ordinary and mundane, was almost painful in its contrast to the unnatural stillness of the forest. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my pulse, trying to convince myself that the stranger and his dark orchestration were confined to that isolated road, that the forest itself was only a backdrop. But fear does not yield to reason, not when it has been meticulously engineered and measured over hours of dread. Dad slowed the car, checking the rear view one last time. Nothing. Only empty darkness and ordinary trees. Mom relaxed slightly, shoulders loosening, holding Tom closer. I tried to settle in my seat, letting the ordinary hum of tires on pavement replace the oppressive silence of the woods. But rational thought was slow to return. My mind replayed the events, the breakdown, the still figure at the edge of the headlights, the metallic glint, the precise, deliberate steps. Nothing about that night had been accidental. Nothing about him had been ordinary. We pulled into a gas station a few miles down, lights glaring, warm and mundane. Dad parked, hands still tight on the wheel. He left the engine running while we stepped out, the normal world suddenly overwhelming after hours of oppressive darkness. The stranger had not followed. Or at least, not physically. But I could feel the lingering awareness, the echo of his patience pressing against my nerves. Inside the store, the fluorescent lights buzzed, illuminating shelves of snacks and cold drinks. I could hear other people talking, laugh lightly, moving with ordinary intention. My pulse began to slow, but I could still feel the forest at the edges of my vision, a memory of menace refusing to fade. I wanted to speak, to explain what had happened, but words felt inadequate. How do you convey deliberate terror, measured by someone who didn't even need to speak? Dad filled up the tank, glancing nervously around. Mom kept Tom close, whispering reassurances. I wandered near the entrance, eyes scanning the parking lot and the distant tree line. Nothing moved. Everything appeared ordinary. And yet, I knew better. The stranger had orchestrated the night with meticulous care. Every step, every pause, every moment of patience had been intentional. He had chosen us, measured our fear, ensured our compliance. When we returned to the car, Dad started the engine and pulled onto the main highway. The darkness receded behind us, lights of towns dotting the distance. The forest was no longer immediately threatening, yet I could feel the residual weight of that presence. I pressed my forehead against the window, breathing in slowly, attempting to exorcise the sensation of being watched, measured, evaluated. The ordinary world returned slowly, almost painfully, but my mind remained tethered to the memory of that night. Hours later, we arrived at a motel, fluorescent lights harsh but reassuring. Dad parked near the entrance, and for the first time in hours, we stepped out together, legs trembling from adrenaline and fear. I checked the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see a dark figure among the shadows of the trees lining the lot. Nothing. Only the parking area, empty and mundane. I wanted to believe it was over. Inside the room, Mom locked the door behind us, checked the windows. Tom curled on the bed, asleep almost immediately, exhausted from tension and fear. Dad sat silently, staring at the floor, hands clasped together. I tried to speak, but no words came. The ordinary world felt fragile, precarious, as if at any moment the forest or the stranger could reach back and reclaim us. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, mind replaying the night in horrifying detail. I realized with a cold certainty that survival did not erase the presence, did not nullify the intelligence behind it. We had escaped physically, but the encounter had been deliberate, calculated, and unforgettable. The stranger had tested us, measured us, marked us. And though we were safe now, I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, that the edge of the forest would always wait, patient, deliberate, and infinitely watchful. The night had been orchestrated to ensure one truth: that fear, when calculated with precision, is more effective than force. And we had lived because we had survived its test, not because the danger had relented. I closed my eyes, aware that some presences cannot be contained, that some darkness waits patiently, indefinitely, for the next moment of vulnerability. We were safe for now, but the forest, the stranger, and the deliberate terror of that night would never leave. Story 6, Familiar Stranger. I thought it was coincidence at first. A shadow in the corner of the grocery store, a man lingering near the produce section as I compared apples, his gaze flicking in my direction for just long enough to make my stomach tighten. I had convinced myself it was nothing. After all, I shopped at the same store nearly every day, and the aisles were always crowded. People came and went. Faces blurred. Still, the moment lingered, an odd weight in my chest that refused to dissipate. That evening, walking home, I tried to ignore the feeling, the lingering impression of eyes watching me. The streets were quiet, the city settling into the predictable hum of late afternoon. I glanced over my shoulder instinctively, more to reassure myself than anything else. And there he was, standing across the street, leaning lightly against a lamppost. Ordinary clothing, an ordinary stance, yet somehow impossibly out of place. His eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, and then he turned, disappearing into the crowd. I rationalized it again. Perhaps it was coincidence, a stranger in a busy city who happened to look my way. My apartment building was only a few blocks from the grocery store, a familiar route I had walked countless times. By the time I climbed the stairs to my door and locked it, I had almost convinced myself that nothing had happened. Almost. Over the next few days, the appearances grew more frequent. I noticed him at the park, sitting on a bench as I jogged along the trail, reading a newspaper in such a way that his head was always turned toward me. The first time I saw him there, my heart skipped, a small, irrational fear clawing at my throat. I tried to shake it, telling myself he could be anyone, a jogger, a reader, a man with a penchant for the same park routes. Yet something about the precision of his positioning, the timing, made me uneasy. I began to notice patterns. He was always just far enough away to avoid direct confrontation, but close enough that I couldn't ignore him. My grocery trips became exercises in scanning aisles, careful not to glance at mirrors or reflective surfaces where I might catch his reflection. I began to vary my route home, taking side streets and longer paths, hoping to break the pattern, but the sense of observation persisted. The unease bled into ordinary moments. I would find myself checking the corners of my apartment, peering out of windows at street corners, counting the minutes until I could leave for work or errands with some semblance of normalcy. Even when I stayed indoors, a flicker of anxiety chased me. The man seemed to know where I would be, and more unnervingly, when. One afternoon, I went to a small cafe I frequented. I chose a table in the corner, near the window, trying to relax with a book. The sound of the espresso machine, the low murmur of conversations, the clink of cups all should have been comforting, grounding. And yet, I felt a pull at the edge of my attention, the familiar prickle of being watched. I looked up casually, and my stomach dropped. He was sitting at a table across the room, reading a magazine, but his head was tilted, eyes unmistakably trained on me. I didn't move. I couldn't. I felt frozen in the strange tension between wanting to acknowledge him and fearing the consequences of doing so. Rational explanations began to fracture. Maybe he was following me. Maybe he had memorized my routines, the places I frequented, the streets I walked. But why? The thought was too intrusive, too specific. A stalker? A man with some cruel fascination? My hands shook slightly as I sipped coffee I didn't taste, my mind racing through every potential escape, every possible confrontation. That night, I changed my route home again, weaving through back streets, careful to avoid predictable patterns. The city was quieter than usual, the hum of distant traffic low and uneven. I felt watched, even without seeing him. And then, as I turned the corner to my apartment building, there he was standing near the entrance, just beyond the light cast by the street lamp. Ordinary posture, ordinary clothing, yet impossibly deliberate. He had anticipated my change in routine. My pulse thundered, heart hammering, my hands trembling as I fumbled with keys, trying to unlock the door without looking at him directly. Inside, I bolted the door and pressed my back against it, trembling. The apartment felt smaller, suffocating, the walls closing in as if echoing the tension of the night. I kept a careful watch on the window, every flicker of movement outside making my heart race. Rationality whispered weak reassurances. Maybe he was gone, maybe he was just another passerby. Yet instinct screamed otherwise. He knew my routines. He had positioned himself. He was deliberate. By the time I collapsed on the couch, exhausted and tense, I knew this was no ordinary encounter. The sense of being hunted, of being observed, had invaded the ordinary corners of my life. Grocery stores, parks, my own home, they were no longer safe. The stranger had inserted himself into the predictable pattern of my life, and I had no idea what he wanted, or how far he would go to make sure I knew he was there. I lay awake that night, lights on, doors locked, blinds drawn. Every creak in the apartment sounded amplified, every shadow a potential threat. I felt him outside, or perhaps merely the echo of him, and I realized that my ordinary life had been fractured, replaced with a constant, gnawing dread. The appearances were no longer random. He was deliberate, patient, and always watching. And I knew, deep in my chest, that this was only the beginning. The next day, I tried to convince myself it had been coincidence. Morning sunlight spilled into my apartment, golden and mundane, ordinary enough to soothe frayed nerves. I went through my usual routine, coffee, breakfast, skim the news. Nothing seemed amiss. I even laughed at a text from a friend, trying to reclaim some normalcy. Yet beneath the veneer of routine, unease coiled tightly in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching me that night, outside, hidden in shadow, patient and deliberate. At the grocery store, I caught myself scanning the aisles compulsively, eyes darting, searching for familiar shapes. I told myself it was irrational, paranoid, that surely no one would follow so consistently. And yet, there he was, or so it felt when I rounded the corner into the cereal aisle. A man, ordinary in appearance, wearing a jacket I had seen before but now seemed inextricably linked to my anxiety. He wasn't doing anything, just standing. Waiting. The ordinary act of grocery shopping had transformed into a theater of dread. I left quickly, moving toward the parking lot with forced nonchalance. Heart pounding, I scanned the rows of cars. Empty, at first glance. But as I turned to unlock mine, there he was again. Across the lot, leaning against a lamppost, hands in pockets, expression neutral, eyes impossibly fixed on me. My pulse surged. I fumbled with my keys, aware that every ordinary sound, the click of the lock, the distant hum of traffic, felt amplified, as if the world were conspiring to make me notice him. I told myself to drive, to put distance between us. I tried to rationalize. Maybe he was a random observer, someone who found me coincidentally at both locations. But as I emerged onto the street, scanning reflections in shop windows, I felt a growing certainty. He knew my routines. My panic rose in tandem with a creeping realization that this wasn't random. It was deliberate. He had mapped my patterns, anticipated my movements, and he was patient. Patient and methodical. At work, I tried to settle into ordinary tasks, emails, spreadsheets, routine phone calls, but my mind remained fragmented. Every noise, every glance from a passing colleague became a potential threat. I imagined him watching from the street below, or crouched at the edge of a park I sometimes visited at lunch. Even in a room filled with familiar coworkers, I could feel him, a phantom presence threading through the ordinary spaces of my day. By evening, I was hyper-aware of my surroundings. Walking home, I chose streets I had never used before, weaving through back alleys, hoping to escape observation. And yet, no matter the variation, the feeling persisted. I felt him before I saw him, a presence, deliberate and patient, always positioned just outside the periphery of my vision. And then, inevitably, I caught a glimpse, across a deserted side street, leaning lightly against a wall, expression neutral, eyes trained on me. My breath caught, chest tightening, as I realized he had followed me yet again, effortlessly. I started to notice other details that unnerved me. A car parked nearby with tinted windows, headlights off, engine silent, yet somehow positioned to maintain a line of sight to my apartment. Shadows that seemed to linger longer than natural, bending subtly, shaping themselves around ordinary objects as if observing. The city, once familiar, had become an oppressive labyrinth, ordinary routines now laced with calculated observation. That night, I couldn't sleep. I left lights on, blinds drawn tight, checked every lock, listened to every faint sound outside. Every creak, every whisper of wind seemed amplified, as if the stranger had infiltrated the ordinary world itself. My phone buzzed occasionally with messages from friends, innocuous texts that normally brought comfort. But even those felt tainted, reminders that my life had been subtly but irrevocably infiltrated. By the third day, I was avoiding the places I loved. The park, the cafe, even the grocery store all transformed into stages where I imagined him appearing, watching, waiting. And inevitably, he did. Every sighting was like a puncture in the fragile bubble of my ordinary life. I realized with sinking clarity that this was no longer about coincidence or chance. The stranger was deliberate, patient, and unrelenting. He had inserted himself into the predictable patterns of my life, and there was no obvious way to remove him. I tried to imagine a rational explanation, a man who coincidentally frequented the same locations, a series of unrelated events. But rationality was failing. The consistency, the patience, the impossibly precise timing all pointed to one undeniable truth. He knew me. He knew my habits. And he was waiting for something. I didn't know what, but the gnawing certainty in my chest told me it would be deliberate, personal, and unescapable. By the time I locked my apartment door that night, I realized my ordinary world had been fractured. The stranger had woven himself into the predictable rhythms of my life, an invisible presence that refused to be ignored. And for the first time, I understood that the terror was no longer subtle. It had begun to close in. By the third week, fear had begun to seep into the edges of my consciousness, coloring every ordinary moment. I no longer left the apartment without first scanning the street, the sidewalks, even the tops of parked cars. Shadows became threats, reflections, betrayals. Every passing stranger was a potential threat, every sudden movement a reminder that he could be anywhere, waiting. I had begun varying my routines, changing routes, times, even the coffee shop I visited. And yet, it didn't matter. He appeared anyway. I first saw him that day at the bus stop. I had left my apartment cautiously, using side streets and alleyways to avoid detection, or so I thought. The air was crisp, ordinary commuters waiting for the next bus, their chatter filling the morning silence. I leaned against a wall, trying to blend in, keeping my back to the street. Then I felt it, the prickle at the base of my neck, the instinctive chill of being watched. I turned just slightly. Across the street, on the corner, he was standing. Hands in pockets, expression neutral, watching me with the precision of someone who had anticipated every step I would take. I froze. My chest tightened. Rational thought fled as instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to flee. Yet something held me in place. Part fear, part disbelief, part the sick fascination that comes from encountering someone whose patience and obsession are incomprehensible. He didn't move. He didn't wave. He simply existed, deliberate and unrelenting, a constant shadow in the bright morning. The bus arrived. I slipped on, finding a seat near the rear, heart hammering in my ears. Through the window, I watched him remain on the corner, unwavering, until the bus moved out of sight. Even as the city blurred past, I could feel the weight of his gaze lingering in the spaces I occupied. It wasn't just observation, it was intent, a careful measurement of my life. That evening, I attempted normalcy, convincing myself that if I ignored him, he would disappear. I went to the grocery store, trying to shop quickly, moving past familiar aisles with deliberate distraction. But the feeling returned immediately, subtle at first, then insistent. I caught glimpses of him in reflective surfaces, the glass of the freezer door, a polished countertop, fleeting and brief. The recognition hit me every time, gut twisting, and I began to understand that ignoring him was impossible. At home, I became hyper-aware of every sound. The apartment seemed smaller, every ordinary creak magnified into a potential threat. I installed a small security camera near the entrance, hoping for reassurance. Hours later, reviewing the footage, I froze. There he was, not outside the building, but near the door, lingering for minutes without moving, his face impossible to read, expression neutral, watching. How had he found my building? How had he known my schedule? Rational explanations fractured under the weight of certainty. Sleep became impossible. I lay awake, lights on, every lock checked multiple times, ears straining for the faintest sound. The sense of being observed was no longer occasional, it was constant. I noticed it in reflections, in passing cars, in the shifting shadows outside my windows. The ordinary city had become a maze designed to keep me exposed, aware, anxious. Every footstep, every distant car horn, every whisper of wind carried the gnawing possibility that he had arrived without my noticing, waiting for a moment of vulnerability. Then, one night, it escalated. I returned from a late errand, cautious and alert. As I unlocked my apartment door, I felt it immediately, a presence just behind me, closer than before. I spun around. Nothing. Just the hallway, empty, dimly lit by the building's corridor lights. Heart pounding, I fumbled with keys, finally forcing the door open and bolting inside. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But as I pressed my back against the door, I realized with sinking dread, he didn't need to confront me directly to terrify me. The knowledge that he could appear anywhere, at any moment, was a weapon in itself. Days bled together. My routines became exercises in careful calculation. Groceries, errands, even walks outside were planned like military operations. Yet he remained, appearing inevitably, at the corner store, at the cafe, even once outside my office building, leaning casually against a lamppost, waiting. Always patient. Always deliberate. Always watching. By the time I returned home one night, exhausted and trembling, I understood the terrifying truth. This was no ordinary stalker. He had inserted himself into the pattern of my life, becoming a constant, inescapable presence. His patience, precision, and intimate knowledge of my routines meant there was nowhere I could go, no time I could escape. My ordinary life, once predictable and safe, had become a cage, and he held the key. And I knew, in the marrow of my bones, that the next step, the confrontation, the revelation, the inevitable escalation, was approaching. The next evening, I didn't go out. I stayed inside, doors locked, blinds drawn, convinced that if I remained stationary, the stranger would abandon his pursuit. I told myself rationally that this was precaution, that he was a man, a human with limits. But rational thought had been steadily eroding for weeks. My routines, my habits, even my perception of time were under siege. I could feel his awareness everywhere, a patient weight pressing against the edges of my consciousness. I was pacing my apartment when the knock came. At first, I thought I had imagined it. Then it came again, deliberate, slow, measured. My heart slammed against my ribs. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. Silence. Then, from the peephole, I saw him. Standing there, expression neutral, hands in pockets, posture casual, but every detail screamed intent. I froze, body tense, every muscle coiled. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything that would reclaim control, but my instinct screamed that panic would play directly into his hands. He had orchestrated every encounter with precision. I could feel it, an invisible choreography that I had been unwillingly cast in, and he was now moving toward the climax. Then he spoke. The sound of his voice, calm, soft, but deliberate, sliced through the tension. You shouldn't be afraid. Not yet. My stomach twisted. How did he know? How did he know I had been alone, pacing, checking the locks repeatedly? I wanted to respond, to demand answers, but no words would come. The sound of my own pulse drowned out rational thought. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the peephole, imagining escape routes, calculating distances. He didn't move from the hallway, didn't knock again. Just waited, patient, deliberate, in a way that made every second unbearable. My apartment, my sanctuary, had become the stage for a calculated psychological siege. Every corner felt exposed, every shadow a potential entry. Then my phone buzzed. I picked it up, trembling, expecting a call from a friend or a delivery notification. Instead, a text from an unknown number appeared. I can see everything you do. My breath hitched, chest constricting. I dropped the phone onto the table, numb with fear. Rationality fled entirely. This was no longer a man observing from a distance. He had knowledge, insight, and a capacity to invade my private space with terrifying precision. I realized then that waiting for him to leave was no longer an option. Every moment of inaction strengthened his position. I grabbed a jacket and keys, heart hammering, and decided to flee, moving quietly to the back exit of my building. The hallways were empty, the ordinary dim lighting doing little to erase the sense of menace. My mind raced, the streets were exposed, but remaining inside meant the siege would continue. As I stepped outside, the night was heavy, still, and unnervingly quiet. No ordinary sounds of traffic or distant voices, only the subtle crunch of gravel beneath my shoes. I froze. There he was. Not on the street, not on the sidewalk, but emerging from the shadow of a side alley, hands again in pockets, expression neutral. He moved toward me slowly, deliberately, each step measured, unhurried. There was no panic in his movement, only inevitability. I ran. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but my fear pushed me forward. I darted between streetlights, shadows stretching unnaturally, every corner a potential trap. He followed silently, effortlessly, always just at the periphery of vision. The city, which had once been comforting in its noise and lights, now felt like a maze constructed solely for my terror. Each turn I took, each alley I avoided, seemed anticipated, expected. He knew my moves before I did. Finally, I reached a 24-hour diner, lights glaring, people around, ordinary and oblivious. I burst inside, heart hammering, gasping for breath. I looked back. The street was empty. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a moment of disbelief, a flicker of hope. But deep inside, I knew he had not vanished. The patient, deliberate nature of his pursuit suggested he had measured the encounter, determined my habits, and would wait for another opportunity. Inside the diner, I sat shaking, wrapping my arms around myself. The ordinary hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes, should have been comforting, grounding. And yet, I couldn't shake the certainty that he was out there. Not visible, not active, yet watching, always watching. The fear was no longer occasional or coincidental. It had become a permanent, suffocating presence in my life, and I understood, with a cold, bone-deep certainty, that it would never fully leave. I didn't sleep that night. Every glance at the street outside my window made my stomach tighten, every distant noise a potential signal. The diner had been a temporary refuge, a bubble of ordinary activity, but I knew it could not last. By morning, I had to leave the city, escape the orbit of someone who had tracked me so precisely, who had anticipated every step I took. I packed lightly, deliberately, everything carefully planned to avoid predictability. Yet, even in my meticulous preparation, I felt the invisible weight of him pressing against my decisions. I called a cab and requested a driver I had never used before, instructed them to avoid familiar streets. The city blurred past, ordinary and indifferent, yet the sense of being observed was a constant hum in my chest. Every car on the road, every pedestrian passing the window, could be him, measuring my movements. My hands were clammy on my lap, heart hammering with a rhythm that refused to relent. Rational thought offered no comfort, the pattern had been established too thoroughly. The cab deposited me at a train station I had never visited, one of the few still operating early in the morning. I bought a ticket for the next train out of the city, avoiding the usual stations, routes, and schedules I would normally use. Every second felt like a calculation, every decision a potential misstep. And yet, somewhere deep inside, I realized that even these precautions might be futile. He had been patient for weeks, deliberate in every observation. Was there a limit to his patience? Or did he simply wait until the perfect opportunity presented itself? I waited on the platform, shifting nervously from foot to foot, scanning the crowd without making it obvious. And then I saw him. A flicker in the corner of my eye, leaning against a distant pillar, expression neutral, hands in pockets. He had anticipated this too. My pulse jumped. I ducked behind a column, heart racing, breath shallow. He didn't move toward me. He didn't need to. The knowledge that he was there, that he had tracked me this far, was enough to unnerve me completely. The train arrived, a roar of steel and air. I boarded quickly, finding an empty carriage and sinking into a seat near the door, my eyes scanning the windows for any sign of him. The city receded into darkness behind us, the ordinary hum of train mechanics providing a faint reassurance. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, trying to imagine that with distance, the presence would fade. Hours passed. The train rattled forward through the countryside. I allowed myself a fleeting sense of relief, convincing myself that the vastness of the landscape, the unpredictability of travel, might break the pattern. Yet, as I gazed out of the window at fields and distant lights, I realized a horrifying truth. He didn't need proximity to observe me. The knowledge he had accumulated, the patience he had demonstrated, suggested that my life, my routines, my very existence, had been catalogued, mapped, and anticipated to a degree that distance could not erase. I spent the night on the train in a tense, restless stupor, unable to sleep, unable to relax. At every station, I scanned for him, expecting a figure to emerge from the shadows, to step aboard as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But he did not appear physically. Still, the fear did not abate. The psychological invasion was complete. He had turned my ordinary life into a labyrinth of observation, and even now, As the train carried me forward, I could not shake the sensation that he remained connected to me in some invisible, deliberate way. By morning, I arrived in a small town far from the city, ordinary streets, ordinary people, ordinary houses. I rented a small room above a shop, determined to start fresh, to re-establish some semblance of normalcy. And for the first time in days, I allowed myself a cautious breath. The absence of immediate threat was intoxicating, a fragile reassurance. But as I unpacked my few belongings, I glanced out the window at the street below and froze. On the corner, just beyond the light of a street lamp, stood a figure. Hands in pockets, expression neutral. The posture, the calm patience, the deliberate stillness, it was him. He had not followed in the conventional sense. He did not need to. His presence had become a shadow over my life, a constant, inescapable observation. I sank to the floor, back against the wall, staring at the window, every nerve taut. The city was behind me, the train long gone. Yet he was here. Patient, deliberate, inescapable. I understood then, fully and irreversibly, that this was not a man who could be outrun. He existed within the pattern of my life itself, a presence that distance, relocation, or rational planning could not disrupt. I realized, with a chilling clarity, that my ordinary life, my routines, and my perception of safety had been irreversibly fractured. And he would remain, waiting, watching, patient, deliberate. I was alive, yes, but the freedom I had once taken for granted was gone. The ordinary world was no longer mine. It belonged to him through presence, through observation, through control. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, hoping that denying him acknowledgement might grant me some illusion of safety. But I knew it was only an illusion. He was everywhere, and always would be.